Well, hello again from the Comic Book Historians podcast. I'm Alex Grand with my co-host Jim Thompson. Today we have a special guest, Danny Fingeroth. Danny Fingeroth spent nearly 2 decades as a writer and editor for Marvel Comics, an expert in comics writing, editing, and history. He has spoken about comics and their creators at venues including the Smithsonian Institution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Columbia University. Danny has taught comics writings at multiple universities and was a longtime group editor of Marvel's Spider-Man line, and has written many comics including the Deadly Foes of Spider-Man limited series and the entire 50-issue run of Darkhawk, and was a consultant to the Fox Kids Spider-Man animated series. So Danny, those words probably sound pretty familiar to you. We're really excited to have you here. Jim's going to start off with kind of the early days before your comics career. Jim, take it away.
Okay. Hi, Danny.
Hi, guys.
When and where were you born?
I was born in New York, New York. I was born in the 50s. Let's leave it vague like that. But I'm a sort of prime era baby boomer.
So did you play with Howard Chaykin when you were a baby?
No, Howard lived in a faraway land called Brooklyn. I was.
So I joke about that, but it seems like everyone is born in New York. That seems to be the common denominator in not everyone, but almost everyone that we've spoken with on this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, there's a lot of historical reasons. Sort of in my case, for me to kind of take a chance on looking for a job at Marvel Comics meant I did not have to fly cross-country or hitchhike from another country. I just had to get on the subway. So I was risking a subway token in terms of my curiosity and my interest in possibly working in comics. So, I think there's a local, the 2 major mainstream comic companies and even much of the underground world started in and until recently was in and around New York City. So so if you're a local kid and you love comics and you're sort of looking for what you're obsessed with it from an early age and or you're kind of trying to figure out what you're going to do as a grown-up for a living and for a career. And it's here. There's kind of a mentoring network. There's the publishers. This is where the earliest comic conventions were. And I guess there's probably even an aspect that especially the Marvel stories literally took place in New York. So,
yeah, they're all in New York, yeah.
New York has this, I'm not sure if you guys have ever lived in New York, but it's a funny thing to live in a place that's both real and mythical simultaneously. So that there's the real New York of crowded subways and dog shit and pollution and crazy drivers, and the Metropolitan Opera, and the Metropolitan Museum, and
the lows and the highs, yeah.
So there's all the lows and the highs, and you could probably spend several months just watching movies that are about some dream world of New York. So to grow up in a place that's the object of so many people's fantasies, if you go to any city, if you go anywhere in the world or anywhere in America, you will find expatriate New Yorkers who, for whatever reason, got the hell out. So as many people are dying to get into New York, that's as many people are dying to get out of New York.
So basically it just comes down to the location of where the Marvel was, and also that you were born and lived just close to there. Yeah, but then there's also the culture as well. Okay.
So tell us a little bit about your family growing up, your parents.
Importantly, which comics did you read as a kid?
I was born and raised in pre-gentrification Manhattan. There was the New York of crime and pollution and decay that I'm not claiming that I grew up impoverished because I didn't, but that was sort of, none of my suburban relatives were jealous that I was growing up in Manhattan. We were all sort of like, oh, it's too bad they never made it to the suburbs, But my parents were from a similar background to a lot of the comic book creators, which was first generation American-born children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. That's what I have in common with Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Howard Chaykin. So, that was probably subconsciously something that attracted me to the comics. And then, when I became interested in doing them professionally and learning more about comics history, my parents and aunts and uncles grew up and played and, and made their way through the same streets that Will Eisner and that whole generation lived.
Right.
So that's my background. Sort of like being a famous comic book editor means that you're famous to like 1/10 of 1% of the population, unless you're Stan Lee.
Right.
My father was a well-known cantor. He led services at one of the larger Catskills hotels called the Nevele, which was sort of a step, in the same league as Grossinger's and the Concord, if you know your Jewish New York area history, and also was in the banquet catering business, and also had a law degree. So that was kind of like Eisner's family. And my mother was a speech therapist in the New York school system. As far as my reading comics, I think they were glad I was reading something. They never forbid me to read comics. I had a friend who even though he was among the poorer kids in this yeshiva that I went to through 8th grade, his parents owned a candy store in the Bronx, which meant he got the comics before anybody. Even though he was, technically not as well-to-do as some of my classmates, he was the only one I was really jealous of. He's like, oh man, he gets the comics.
That's right.
And he gets them for free.
Were you an early reader?
Yeah, I was one of those kids who, like in 1st grade, when people were struggling with Dick and Jane, I would just be like, just read the friggin' thing. It's run, spot, run. What is so difficult?
Yeah, that's a common factor in everybody we interview too. They're all the comic people seem to be early readers.
And comics were a big part of that. And comics did, it's almost a cliche, but I guess it's true. Comics did use large vocabulary, certainly larger than a lot of the books you would be reading in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, even 3rd grade. It's funny because even though they were clearly aimed at children, and yet some of them dealt with very sophisticated stories and themes, that even in the pre-Marvel era, you could see that comics had all this smart stuff lurking under the surface, the EC comics, certainly. So my background, so I read comics from early. My earliest memory is my mom reading me a Popeye comic.
Oh, cool.
Probably because, Popeye cartoons were popular when I was a kid.
Uh-huh.
So it must have been the transition. And then my cousin Steve was a
like in 1960 reader. Or something? Was that 1960?
Yeah, it would have been more like 58,
58, okay.
58, 59. I had an older cousin who was a comics reader, used to give them to me, so I can't remember literally my first comic. I have this vague memory of being a Popeye thing, and then, I was reading them early, and I got into the superheroes, something about that. I remember reading Sad Sack and Popeye, and in elementary school, I think I'm from an era when every kid read comics for a year or two, or read them casually, whether it was Archie or Casper the Friendly Ghost or Superman. But there were 2 or 3 other kids. I was in a class of like 50 kids in this school I was in. We were all in the same. We kind of progressed together through school, and in that group there were 2 or 3 other kids who were, into comics more than casually. Who, one of them was the one who said, after I'd been reading for a few years, said, "There's this new thing called the Fantastic Four you should check out." So that was sort of my grapevine, and then there. I grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, on the wrong side of Lexington Avenue. People who know Manhattan will know what I mean. I'm so old, there was literally a brewery a block away from my house making Rupert Knickerbocker beer. If you can imagine, sort of your movie image of the glamour of Manhattan, and suddenly there's a factory making beer down the block as if we were in some town in Ohio or something. No offense, Ohio listeners. There were a couple of newsstands where I bought so many comics that when I went away to summer camp, even though I would leave my mother a detailed list of what comics to get me, because, God forbid I would miss an issue of anything, the guy at the newsstand already knew what I wanted, and I had a credit line with him. Sometimes I owed him as much as like 60 cents,
Wow, okay.
But
that's pretty cool.
He did not send the leg breakers out, luckily.
Right.
There were also some secondhand magazine shops that sold comics in the neighborhood, and that was always, and I remember there was one in the Bronx, because I had a lot of Bronx roots, because that's where my parents were from, and they worked, and my grandparents lived. I remember buying Fantastic Four number 2 as a back issue, and
nice.
I paid 5 cents for it, because it was an old comic. You weren't going to pay full price for an old comic book.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I pretty much lived and breathed those comics, and I was the perfect age for Marvel when it came out. When Marvel started, if you sort of look through your comic history, you'll see there are a lot of people born somewhere between 1951 and 1955 who ended up in the business. You know, I think that was, if you were like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old and you've got your first dose of Marvel comics, of the first Marvel comics, then it really was transformative.
Did you ever write any letters?
Yes, but what I did was, and I look back now, I mean, I felt so as if I knew Stan and Jack and Steve, that I would write these long, rambling, comprehensive letters. Like, here's what I thought of every single thing you did this month. And of course, you know, once you're on the inside, you go, well, nobody's printing like a 10-page letter. You know, if you write a reasonably intelligent and witty 50-word letter, you have a much better chance of getting it printed. So I did write letters. I think I did get some of those postcards, you know, thanking me from Stan and the gang.
Oh, that's cool.
I never joined the Merry Marvel Marching Society, I have to admit. I just sort of compared, well, you could be a Superman of America for a dime, or join the Merry Marvel Marching Society for $1, and I just couldn't. I could never justify that, which, you know, might be indicative of the fact that I never really got involved in organized fandom. So I wasn't one of those kids who had a fanzine and who corresponded. Sort of, I had this obsession with comics, and at a certain point, it became just with Marvel Comics.
So that Stan and Jack stuff really sucked you in.
Totally. I was who they were looking for. You know?
Yeah, the target audience, as they say.
Yeah. And how old were you when you thought for the first time, I might want to do this for a living?
Probably pretty young. I'd say, because accompanied by my fascination with and obsession with comics, I was obsessed with drawing. I drew all the time. Superheroes, baseball players. I'd draw, you know, the Marvel and DC heroes. I'd make up my own characters. You know, I was a big New York Yankees fan, so I'd be drawing Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. You know, so I think I figured out, obviously, that somebody was drawing these things. And so I think from pretty early on, I remember, you know, when I'm 12 or 13, here I am, I'm living in Manhattan. So that means I'm in walking distance probably of like the top 10 greatest art schools in the world. But I wanted to take the famous artist course, you know, the mail order correspondence course, the one with Norman Rockwell and Albert Dorn. So I took the test, and shockingly, I passed it. I don't know if anybody ever didn't pass it, you know, so a salesman came to our apartment. My parents were actually, they said, well, think about it for a few days. If you still want it, we'll pay for it. So I wasn't as obsessed as some future professionals. I was a kid, and a few days later, my attention had drifted, and I didn't get the course. I was pretty good for a 12-year-old. I had a friend who was really good, who I think could have been professional, but chose to become both a dentist and a lawyer, you know, so.
There you go.
Instead of, you know, boy.
Secure. That's good. That's good secure work.
You know? Yeah, it is really. Obviously, I'm a writer, an editor, and word person. You have to be a real special kind of kid to love comics and not want to be Jack Kirby. So that was sort of the fantasy I had, that maybe one day I could do what Jack or guys like that did. That was sort of, as a kid, my comic book fantasy. Then I lost interest in the comics that were coming out in the early 70s. You know, I look back on it now and I go, wow, there's a lot of great stuff. But I think it was a combination of the typical becoming interested in, you know, girls and music and school and movies and 100 other things. And
was this around the time that Kirby left Marvel, or did you stay in for...
when Kirby left Marvel is around the time my Marvel interest waned. I did follow, you know, I look at my collection, and I do have most of the Fourth World stuff that Kirby did. And in there, I started developing a certain amount of interest in the undergrounds, but I was never immersed in the undergrounds. I'm certainly familiar with them, and later on I became a huge Harvey Pekar fan. it's kind of the underground. It's almost been more a matter of me catching up. I think at that point in my life, my attention shifted, talking about late high school, my attention shifted to literature, movies, and always a great fondness for the medium of comics. Anytime I saw an article about comics or a news item, I was interested in it. But when I look back on the comics, again, I think it was just sort of my becoming a later adolescent and developing other interests. But I think it was when a certain level of innovation ended and the level of professionalism came in. So I can look at that professionalism now and I can say, boy, these were some really talented people doing these stories. But the explosive excitement where every issue of Fantastic Four and every issue of Spider-Man and every issue of Tales of Suspense would have 10 new cool things and 10 riffs that to me were new. I mean, maybe they were knocked off from, a TV show or a movie or a Shakespeare play or something that I wasn't familiar with. But when it shifted from explosive new things every issue to, here's a very well done, competent, professional comic, that's when my interest started waning.
Yeah, well, the magic is less at that point.
And of course, there is that cliche that's a cliche because it's true that, the golden age of anything is 12,
Alex and I were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, outgrowing it, yeah.
Did you go from high school straight to college?
I went from high school, I went to Bronx Science, and then I ended up in Suny Binghamton, where they had a very unique film program. It had a lot of things in common with comics and Marvel Comics, but it was a film program run by avant-garde film artists, people who most people haven't heard of. The most famous, he didn't teach there, but the kind of filmmaking done by a guy named Stan Brakhage.
Sure, of course. I went to USC grad school and taught film at Duke for 15 years.
Oh, okay. So Ken Jacobs was one of my teachers, if you know Ken's work.
Yeah, of course.
Larry Gottheim was another teacher, Dan Barnett, Saul Levine. So these were people in the Brakhage, obviously we're all unique and different and had their own visions, but it was non-narrative film, which was kind of the very opposite in the sense of a Marvel comic, because Marvel comic is, among the things that Marvel does well is it tells a traditionally structured narrative story. But of course, I was the narrative guy in this non-narrative program, so I didn't take any abuse for it. People respected it, and so I had this kind of fine art school education in this esoteric area of film.
So were you doing production, or was it more critical studies?
I was doing more production, which again was that sort of avant-garde ideal. If you remember a book, this will really date me and whoever knows what I'm talking about. It's a book by a guy named Lenny Lipton, who was also the co-writer of Puff the Magic Dragon, the song. But Lenny Lipton wrote a book called Independent Filmmaking, and the introduction is by Stan Brakhage, and there's a photo in it of Brakhage with a Bolex slung over his shoulder as if he was a gunfighter in a 50s Western, So that sort of, lone, bold genius with a camera was sort of the vision, that sort of replaced Jack Kirby in my imagination. So that was my education. And actually
So when did you finish the film program?
I finished, boy, you want to know my age. I finished in 76. I sort of had a toehold in that world. I had a shared show at a place called the Collective for Living Cinema, which was in Tribeca, where I showed my senior thesis film, and I did some PA work on movies in New York. I didn't want to go to graduate school, at least not yet. I really didn't want to move to Hollywood, especially given sort of my anti-Hollywood aesthetic education. So I came, this is where being from New York sort of comes in handy or determines your fate or something, because like a lot of kids after college, well, I'm going home to live with my mom. My father had passed away when I was in high school, but my mom happened to live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So it was like, okay, well, here I am in the media capital of the world. I have a really cool fine arts education, but, it's one not going to make me rich tomorrow. What am I going to do?
It didn't feel practical at the time, yeah.
It didn't feel practical. It felt like something that I would do for love, and maybe apply for a grant or something. But I mean, even the most well-known, the fact is Stan Brakhage, even being, say the most well-known avant-garde filmmaker, still had to have a day job teaching and spent a lot of his time barnstorming different colleges and museums. I think largely because he had a lot of children that he had to support.
Right, exactly.
So we benefited because we got to see Stan Brakhage and all these other filmmakers in person, but I think given their druthers, that was probably not their ideal way how to spend their time. So I'm back in New York. What am I going to do? Well, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics.
Well, let's go back, and I'm going to hand you over to Alex in a second. Let's go back. You're already a comics professional to some degree at this point, right? Because you've worked in 74.
So basically,
Say it again. No. I think you're jumping.
Now, I had read that you had worked at Atlas Seaboard. Is that correct?
This is totally incorrect. This is the bane of my existence. My first boss was Larry Lieber. Larry Lieber hired me, but he was back at Marvel.
Was he working at the British department at that point?
Yes, Larry had been the editor at Atlas Seaboard during that company's brief existence. And Larry was my first boss. So somewhere, I think it was Jerry Bales who somehow inferred from that I had worked for Larry at Atlas Seaboard. The problem is, that's now in Jerry's Who's Who, and it's therefore in Wikipedia. But Jerry has died, and his wife, I don't think, has any interest in updating
and correcting it.
In correcting it. So yes, it makes me seem older than I am, which I don't like, and it's not true. I came back to New York in '76. I worked a bunch of odd jobs in the local movie industry, and then I knew somebody who got me in on an informational tour to Marvel, where I thought it might be fun to work, and then I had an interview with Larry, who would come back from Seaboard. So I started there in '76. Okay,
so that was totally after Atlas for sure then.
Yeah. Atlas ended in '75. Right. And Larry's running the British department. Right, so that's...
Well, that's great news for us. We've now served a purpose, because anybody listening to this is going to know that's not right. Because I saw that you had worked with Leiber on the British comics, and I wondered if he got you the job because of your past Atlas. Now it all makes sense.
What happened was I went up to Marvel. Like I said, I had a distant connection that got me up there for an informational tour. While I was there, I ran into a guy I went to high school with who was working there, and he helped me, like a year later, get the entry-level job as Larry's assistant in the British department. So that was that was my beginning as a comics professional.
Was that a natural place to go, the British department? Because, again, we've talked to, I think it was Tom Orzechowski and some others, where it seems like that's where they head off there first. Was that a normal first step?
Yeah, I think there were a few years, because there was a lot of new material in the sense that there were new covers and new splash pages, because we split the stories up into chapters, so there were new splash pages, new covers, and there was a lot of kind of, for artists, there was touch-up work and adding zipatone, so you could kind of learn the ropes. There was a little new material. Captain Britain was being put out.
Oh, that Black Knight series and Hulk was great.
Those are fun series.
Right. That was actually done in England. That Hulk series was done. A lot of stuff happened in the British department in a short period of time. So basically, I came in there in '77. Larry was the editor. I was the assistant editor / production manager. And then we had a small bullpen that consisted of, Irving Watanabe, who was a letterer, sat in there and did his work and did a lot of work for us. Duffy Voland. There were people who were who either used the room as freelancers, they used it to work in. Howard Bender, who is an artist whose name you may know, was a staff production artist working in the British department. A guy named David Cohen, who at the time was Sol Brodsky's son-in-law. When I went out to Hollywood to become a musician. So a lot of different people kind of came to the British department. So if you were like a new artist looking to kind of get some practical experience, then come do this splash page, this recap splash page. So a lot of people went to the British department. When I was, I think Tony Isabella was the editor, Scott Edelman, and then it was sort of a kind of a natural funnel into the mainstream editorial department, which if you know your history, if you know your history, in the mid-late 70s, the editorial department was in constant flux. And so what happened was a guy named Des Skin, who had been at that point, I think he was the British publisher of Mad, and I guess he'd probably done a bunch of other stuff too. He approached Marvel about, my impression is, I wasn't in those meetings, of course, but somehow making the British product more authentic. Which made sense. Like, instead of the British comics being put out by a bunch of guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens,
right,
maybe they should be put out by actual English people, So Des convinced Marvel to move the operation to England, and at that point, Larry was doing penciling and also the writing on the Hulk newspaper strip.
Right.
So he segued into that, and I became kind of an all-round assistant. They kind of invented this general assistant job for me. So I was the liaison with England. I was helping them get the reprint material so they could do the books. And I was also the assistant editor on Star Wars, because England was using the Star Wars material at twice the rate that the U.S. was.
Mm-hmm.
So I became Archie Goodwin's assistant on Star Wars. And I worked with Carmine Infantino on a lot of new covers.
Yeah, late 70s, yes.
Right, for the Star Wars, which was, I think he was among the first of my childhood idols that I got to work with. And
that's pretty cool.
And I learned how weird it was. I mean, I worked with guys who I knew, but I couldn't say that they were, they were kind of legendary in my mind as names, but to me, Carmine was always a star, from The Flash and Adam Strange and Batman. Carmine was very good at hitting deadlines. He was the ultimate professional, but there's that weird moment when you're on the phone and you're talking, it's like, hello, childhood idol, I can't believe I'm speaking to you. It was my dream my entire life that one day I might actually get to know you and work with you. Now, where are the friggin' pages?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, because he had to kind of answer to you in some way.
Yeah, well, that's a totally surreal moment. You go, oh, well, this is definitely, we're not in Kansas anymore. I'm definitely.
Yeah. How was Larry Lieber as a boss?
Oh, Larry was great. Actually, Larry is somebody I'm still very friendly with currently. I see him every few weeks, so we have lunch. Larry. I guess everybody has a unique series of people who mentor them and train them, but I may be one of the few people who learned a lot of what I know about comics from Larry, Louise Simonson, and Jim Shooter.
Right.
And then I learned a lot from a lot of other people. Those were the three who either by default or by choice said, I'm going to teach you how to do comics. Larry was terrific. Larry, his brother is who he is, so there's always sort of that in the background, but Larry on his own is incredibly smart and creative and talented,
versatile. He can write and draw. Yeah. It's pretty good.
I worked with Louise Simonson, formerly Louise Jones. What happened was I worked in the British department. Then the British department went to England, and I had this combination, utility player. If you remember, I ran a line of like half a dozen reprint books. So I've got questions about those for sure. Right. So I was a shared assistant between Sol Brodsky and Jim Shooter, which was interesting because let's just say they weren't best friends, So
really?
Interesting. Yeah, that was sort of interesting to be in the middle of. And then about a year later, she was Louise Jones then, came over from Warren, and I was assigned as her assistant, and luckily we got along very well. So she took over. I mean, this is an incredible workload. The X-Men titles, the Conan titles, the Star Wars titles. We were doing like 12 books a month. Micronauts, Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica,
a lot.
And thing, and of course the Dazzler, So
yes.
Let's not get too far ahead because I got questions about those for sure.
Now, was Jim Shooter's style of communication versus Sol Brodsky? That's interesting that you mentioned that. What was like a disagreement between them and difference in style between those two guys? Because Jim Shooter wrote Sol Brodsky's obituary like when he died, so that's interesting.
Well, Jim was the editor-in-chief, so I guess they were different. They were different personalities, and they were different phases in their careers. You know,
Okay.
I mean, even though I'm older now than Sol was then, Sol had nothing to prove. He had a nice job that he was good at. People liked him, and I think he was just sort of. I think he would have been content to just sort of play out however many years he was gonna work till he retired, and he had gone out on his own with Skywald, you know,
Right.
as I see the history now. So yes, he came back. He had an executive position and with numerous responsibilities, but it seemed very much like it was a job to him, which was fine. You know, I mean and he was a very nice guy. People liked him. And I think Shooter was a young, ambitious guy who sort of had a different vision for Marvel and comics and what life was about. And so it was just kind of a clash of two people at two different periods in their life. Then, of course, Sol got suddenly ill and died. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but when Sol was in the Army, his platoon had been one of those groups of soldiers they put in the desert and said, we're going to set off this nuclear device here. You'll be fine. You just stand here. We're going to go into this bunker. You guys stand out here, and you'll be fine. and then I think he and I think a number of other people he served with, you know, all had this kind of cancer that very quickly came on and very quickly spread. Because Sol, I think, was 64, if even that old when he died. And I think it came on very quickly. So that, I think everybody was sort of shocked.
Okay.
That was, again, I have no scientific...
Right, but that makes sense. I mean,
this was sort of the scuttlebutt of how and why Sol suddenly got so ill and passed away. So I think he and Jim were just that they had different worldviews and different things they wanted out of life. And so that just ended up, again, I never saw them have an argument, but my understanding was that they were
not on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, was Stan around at all? I know he wasn't running things per se, but was he in the offices? Did you see him?
Stan was in the office a couple of days a week. I don't have, and it's funny, especially because I wrote this, writing this biography of him. I've been racking my brain for what's my first memory of meeting Stan, and I can't remember it. He was just there. He was certainly there enough when I started out that no cover, if he was in the office, no cover left the office without him seeing it and approving, it before it went to the printers.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that certainly there were times, say if Larry was out sick or on vacation, where I'd have to go to Stan and get the British department covers approved by him, but I can't, it's killing me, but I can't remember. I should probably just make up something so I have a story to tell, But yeah, he was definitely a presence. He was there. There would be like large, editorial or company-wide meetings where he would say a few words. And I think he was hands-on with the various editors-in-chief. So I think he was traveling a great deal to the West Coast, and then by 1980 he moved completely out there.
Yeah, because he went to Hollywood, so yeah.
All right, so you were moved over from the British stuff to editing the American reprints, The Amazing Adventures, which was the X-Men, Tales to Astonish.
It's a simultaneous, but go on, yeah.
Okay, Tales to Astonish, Submariner, Marvel Super Action, Avengers, and the Silver Surfer Fantasy Masterpieces.
Right.
But not Marvel Tales. Was that under a different fiefdom, or why was that not one of them?
My understanding of the whole reason for me getting those books existing at all, was that Marvel had promised its advertisers that they would be in a certain number of, X million comics every month. And I think in order to fulfill that commitment, they had to rush these reprint titles out.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never heard that before.
So I guess whoever had Marvel Tales, and also I think maybe Marvel's Greatest Comics also.
Right.
I think that, the idea was not, this one person should supervise this reprints. The idea was, we need this reprints. Danny has a light workload, ergo, Danny is now editing these. And then, I guess to Shooter, I said, can I put my name in as reprint editor? And he said, fine. So that's how that ended up happening.
Nice.
And then the thing that I had to do with most of those was delete a certain amount of material, because I think these were 20 or 22-page stories. We had to fit into 17-page
formats or
18-page formats.
Oh, so some panels are missing, actually.
Oh yeah. If you go through, I mean, that's I think for purists, those they don't like those for that reason.
Was that hard for you to take a issue of Lee Buscema's Silver Surfer and say, I'm going to lose this page and this page?
I think in that case it was sort of the opposite. In that we split them into two. I think those worked okay. Somehow I don't remember. I remember being more an issue with the Avengers and with the Submariner. Here's the thing. I was not from fandom. I was a fan and a passionate lover of comics as a kid, but I didn't fetishize them that way. I do now. But when I was in my early 20s coming into the business, I even did. Here's something I did that will really bring down the wrath of your listeners on me. In one of the Buscema reprints, it might have been the Surfer, but I think it was an Avengers reprint. There was some scene where there were a couple of small-time hoodlums robbing a truck or something, and I had the production department white out, they were, whatever they called each other. I had them white out their names and put in the names of two of my friends. At that point it was like,
you're editor, why not?
I'm the editor, and who's going to, I couldn't imagine that anybody would notice or care.
How funny.
Now of course I go, oh my God, how could someone, now I'd be horrified if somebody accused me of doing that. But then it was like, well, this will be cute. I'll put my friend.
It is cute, actually.
Now, would you be the one that would decide that it needed a new cover or cover changes, but especially getting, say, Gil Kane to do a cover instead, rather than use the original, or where did that come from?
I'd say most of the time, I guess since I answered to Shooter on those, well, I remember we split up the X-Men stories. So then I would try to get somebody, say John Byrne did one or two covers. Carmine did some splash pages, not because his work looked anything like Kirby and Ryman from 1963, but because Carmine had a contract that guaranteed him X amount of work, and to help him make the contract, a lot of stuff was done just because somebody needed work or was contractually obligated to get, there's a lot of creative decisions, especially back then, that had more to do with fulfilling contracts and commitments. So the X-Men stuff, I remember we definitely split that up into two parts because those stories were so long. And then we had, and then we could put the X-Men Origin 5 pages from the 60s in the back. So that would be, I guess, me, and I guess it would have to be approved by Jim, who I was answering to at the time, as far as getting the covers. I think we put out that Fantasy Masterpieces as a full-size comic, so we didn't ever have to cut the Surfer. We left out the Tales of the Watcher stories that have been in the back of the originals.
That's right. I think that's exactly right.
So I think at least in the case of the ones I did, it was only the Amazing Adventures. Was that the X-Men reprint that we got? Yeah, and again, if we split a story in two, same thing, we get a new splash page done.
Was Marvel Super Special, the Xanadu one, your first assignment where you were editing all new material? And yes, I'm bringing that up.
Wow, that's a good question. All new. Well, I mean, I edited the articles. Louise edited, what a saga that Xanadu was. Because you got a lot of Xanadu stories. I guess that was probably among the first things, because I was in charge of all the articles in that, and I made as many beginner mistakes as anybody else makes as a beginner in terms of the articles, but I think they ultimately were approved by the Xanadu people. Well, you really have studied my career. It's frightening.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what we do.
That's how we function.
I know. So are you going to ask me questions about my ex-girlfriends and ex?
No, I do that for my day job as a divorce lawyer, so I don't bring those up.
My favorite Xanadu story. I mean, the movie, it was not one of the great movies ever made, but when you're working on a project, you have to convince yourself that it is.
You got to get into it.
You become emotionally invested in it. So I remember, we'd done the comic, which was, Louise literally finished editing the comic and left the next day to get married to Walt and leave on their honeymoon. I mean,
cool.
And we had 100 people helping finish it, and then we tried the idea was we were going to do it as a pencils only job, and they'd reproduce from the pencils, but the problem was the technology didn't really exist to do that yet. But I remember, so Joel Silver, this is before he was Joel Silver, this is just Joel Silver, was the producer of Xanadu, and we'd finished the comic, I think, and gone to press. I don't think it had come out yet, but he came in and he took everybody who'd worked on it to this private screening room in Midtown, a couple of blocks from Marvel's offices. And so, we're all pumped because, again, we all, oh boy, we bet it'll be great. It's got Gene Kelly and Olivia Newton-John. It's got all this great music. And the music actually was good. If you ever listen to the soundtrack, it's not a bad soundtrack. So we're all pumped, and then the movie plays. And really, the closest, metaphor I can bring to you is the audience and the producers watching Springtime for Hitler on opening night. They could have substituted our faces just looking at the screen and going, oh my God.
And you're coming from a Stan Brackett's background. This is hilarious.
Well, actually, the lights went up and we all said something polite to Joel Silver and got the hell out of there as fast as we could. When you say from a Stan Brackett's background, my friend David Kasakov, who was active in fandom, and actually was one of the writers of that famous article about Master Race that he wrote with John Benson and Archie Goodwin. So David, I went to college with David, and he studied the same program. I helped him get hired working in production in the British department for about a year when I was in the British department. David ran into Ken Jacobs in Soho at a magazine store, and he showed Ken the Xanadu magazine. And Ken said, jokingly, he said, if I could, I'd go back and lower his grades.
That's funny.
That's great.
I believe it was a joke because I've been in touch with Ken since then. He hasn't mentioned Xanadu.
Now, when you're there during those early years at Marvel, did you make any major friendship? Did you become friends with Archie Goodwin or with any of these people?
Wow.
Mark Grunwald. Was Mark Grunwald a friend of yours?
I have to say, you guys are good interviewers because I've never been asked questions like this. I had close friends from, so-called real life, people I'd gone to, high school and summer camp with. Work friends are difficult. And although, obviously, there are people at Marvel who've met and even gotten married, I had a lot of friends of various levels over the years, a lot of whom I've actually reconnected with on social media. I'd say at different times, people I was close with would include Bob Budiansky, Eileen Martanoff, Scott Edelman, Howard Mackey, Nell Yumto. But there's all sorts of different. Grunwald, certainly. The reason that you're getting such a tongue-tied answer from me really goes to the topic question of.
Yeah, you don't want to insult anybody either.
No, it's not even that. People I don't want to talk about it. I'm just not mentioning that. But it's the idea that you work at a place like Marvel Comics, and it's your first job that ends up lasting close to 20 years. You're growing up in public. So it's this really weird fishbowl thing.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have this combination of these public and private persona.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of people, I'd say right now the closest friends I have from my years in comics, Tom DeFalco, J.M. DeMatteis, Eric Fine. I'm sure I'm leaving out some people who will be offended. But it's a tricky thing, especially if you're somebody's editor or they're your editor or they can determine whether you get work or get promoted or... So boy, oh boy, human relationships are complicated enough, but when you add in this factor of also being involved with people's careers and incomes and egos and creative talents and self-image. Sorry, I know you were expecting me to say blah, blah, blah was a great guy and I hung up, blah, blah, blah. So there was, there was groups of guys I went to lunch with. There were some people that I hung out with. But I would say maybe because I am a native New Yorker and because although there were a lot of native New Yorkers in the business, in my generation, there were a lot of people from who were not
out of town.
So I think for those people, comics, for better or worse, became their social life as well as their professional life. And I was always a little wary about that. I just felt like I was a little cautious about becoming too friendly with people at work. And I had a group of friends, from
outside of it.
From my other lives. So there's a lot of people I liked, a lot of people I hung out with, a lot of people I went to movies and lunches with. I was kind of careful about making my social life and my work life entirely intermeshed.
Right. You didn't want it incestuous.
Yeah, well, comics is incestuous enough, I mean,
right.
One morning you're somebody's editor, and and that same afternoon they're your editor, and
right, like a religious compound in a way.
Well, I guess there's a reason that phrases like "true believers" came to Marvel,
That's true. That's all ties together. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So you started editing new books, I mean, like not just like a special, but around the time of Man-Thing's relaunch, you were doing that when Chris Claremont was writing it?
Well, what happened was I became Louise's assistant. I guess she was the editor or maybe of record, but it was part Marvel, especially under Shooter, but in general, had a farm system almost, that was the best metaphor, and I think we called it that. So if you were someone's assistant, then they would delegate a couple of titles to you to edit. Ones either that were considered marginal, so if you screwed them up, who cared, or, or that had a strong creative team that kind of were on a pretty set course, so again, there was a limit to how much you could mess it up. I think under Louise's supervision, I edited Man-Thing, and I think King Conan, and Kazar eventually.
And that was with Bruce Jones writing it, right?
That was with Bruce Jones writing it, yeah. Again, coming from Shooter, who had a lot of good ideas. The idea was we have figured out the best way to do 22-page superhero comics, at least in 1980, whatever. This is what we consider the state of the art. And so now let's codify it and teach people how to do it. And so they did that. So I started with those comics, and I was also writing the Dazzler at the same time. And I was editing the Dazzler. I was editing the Dazzler, and then it was a big editorial crisis. Tom was unhappy with the editorial decision that I made. This is, of course, the irony of life again, but of comics too, is that, I mentioned to you that two people I consider some of my closest friends are DeFalco and DeMatteis. They're guys who have every right not to talk to me because I really butchered some of their stories as an editor.
I see. There's more conflict there.
But they're actual grown-ups who were able to separate, and of course I think I got better, as an editor.
But you were you were listed in the credits as co-writing Dazzler as of issue 6, and then went on to write it. Was it actual co-writing, or did you take it over?
There's a reason Tom is considered a top professional. It's because he's a top professional. So Tom had outlined, 3 or 4 issues in advance. So his outlines really, for many artists, would have been enough to do a plot, but I took those outlines, and then with Shooter, who took over as editor, expanded them into more detailed plots, which Frank Springer then penciled. So the credits are correct. I think there's something like story. So Tom had come up with the basic story, but I fleshed it out into more detail and wrote the dialogue.
Yeah, and what was Frank Springer like to work with?
Swell.
Okay.
He had a lot of experience by that point.
Yeah, Frank, whatever.
Did you think he was a good match on the book? Were you happy that he was the artist?
I didn't have any. Yeah, whatever. Sorry. Okay. I just assume not talk about that. Frank.
All right. So you did about
professional. He did his job.
You did about 20 issues of that.
Right.
And then you left, and immediately they bring in Bill Sienkiewicz to do covers, and they're like some of my favorite covers of that time. Did you ever feel like, gee, why didn't I get those?
Actually, Bill had done a lot of covers while I was writing it. He did
do a few, yeah.
He did a whole bunch, yeah. Jim Shooter became obsessed with Dazzler for whatever reason I'll never understand.
Okay, so I was wondering that. So you're not sure what that reason is?
In retrospect, I think he probably wanted to prove that he was skilled enough as an editor and writer to take even, an idea like Dazzler that a lot of people made fun of and make it succeed,
and maybe make a movie.
Make it credible as a mainstream Marvel comic. I think it could have succeeded, but I think the emphasis on the cheesecake aspect of the comics and of the character undermined that intention. I wrote it and I approached it as if it was Iron Man or as if it was Thor, as a serious Marvel comic. But it is sometimes hard when you have a character whose breasts are twice as big as her head to sort of see, and wearing a glowing disco costume to necessarily be taken as seriously as she might be. I think the Dazzler Galactus trilogy was actually very good.
Yeah, I like this.
I mean, I think we did surprise people with a number of those comics, and really did pull off that impossible task of doing, serious 80s style superhero comics with, the Dazzler, who even though she never officially had the disco in front of her name, everybody knew she was the Disco Dazzler.
Disco Dazzler, yeah.
Besides Dazzler, you did some what ifs, beginning with Dazzler becoming the Herald of Galactus. Were those fun books to do?
Love doing what if. What if, I guess even though I wasn't the star Talmudic scholar in my yeshiva, I think there's something about sort of that kind of history and detail parsing that you go back into a story and you try to find the moment where, if this had happened differently, you'd have a whole different set of reality. And then later on in the 90s, I did a lot of what ifs for Craig Anderson. Those were immense fun, again, because as long as you could justify what you were doing as kind of being true to the personalities of the various characters, you could do a lot of stuff and just play with the characters in the ways that you really couldn't in the more mainstream shared universe.
Mm-hmm. Right, I have two more questions, and then I'm going to give you over to Alex for Spider-Man. My first question is the graphic novel X-Men, the God Loves, Man Kills. Were you the chief editor or assistant editor? What was your role in that?
I was the assistant. That was all Louise and Chris and Brent. I mean, I might have put the numbers on top of the pages. I can't say a whole lot for it.
What was your reaction to that? That always seemed like such a major book to come out in terms of those early days of playing with the graphic form that way.
Yeah, it was really impressive. I mean, I knew Brent's work from Kazar, and of course Chris was Chris. I don't know if I have anything profound to add about that. It was this interesting period where the term graphic novel was becoming popular through Will Eisner and through Art Spiegelman, and Mouse, and so you had this thing called the graphic novel, and then Marvel, and in a way that you can't blame them, sort of tried to co-opt that label of graphic novel, and really, I mean, most of what we did was just like really long superhero comics, but some of them were quite good and had really talented people at the top of their game, and I think that's what God Loves, Man Kills. I mean, it's a great title, God Loves, Man Kills.
Yeah, it's a great book.
That's up there with some of the great film noir titles of Hollywood history.
It could be, it easily could be one of those. It's a great title. Yeah.
So as I said, I was literally the assistant on that. I didn't have a whole lot to do with it.
And then you were doing writing work on the official handbook along with Grunwald and Peter Sanderson and a few others. Out of all of them, who was the guy that knew everything already in terms of the history? Was it Sanderson? Grunwald?
Both of them. There was a reason they did that book. I mean, and again, I wrote maybe half a dozen entries, if that many, for the book. I was very much involved with the Marvel Saga.
Right. I love that story. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That was the handbook. There were characters that I was either writing or editing or just had an interest in. I named Kazar's parents after my own parents. Because nobody had ever given them names. So
that's awesome. I like how you're putting your friends and families in these.
That's great information.
You do stuff like that, and it didn't contradict anything. Just nobody had ever given. That was not as egregious as my horrible sin of putting my friends' names in the Avengers reprint.
As far as replacing, but it's fun.
I remember there was one night, a bunch of us were out having dinner, and we were kind of riffing on various handbook, how different characters in history and fiction would be described in the Marvel Universe handbook. And I remember I got a big laugh when I said something like, Jesus could bench press,
10 tons, I would estimate.
Well,
two is stronger.
He had the ability to, transmute.
Water to wine. So you're like Molecule Man, basically.
Right. Pretty much, yeah. Which is actually, I think, how Shooter played him later on in the Secret Wars.
Yeah. So, that's funny. That's a funny comparison. I never thought of equating them.
And then after this is done, Spider-Man takes over your life. to some degree. And I'm going to hand you off to Alex primarily for this part.
And that was around 1982-ish, right? You started editing Spider-Man with Tom DeFalco, is that right?
1983.
Early 83, okay.
Yeah, I was working for Louise for a little over 3 years. I was editing some comics with her. I don't remember. I think at that point I had handed off the British liaison work to somebody else. You know, a lot of these things, this is a long time ago. Mm-hmm. In early 83, you know, Tom had come on staff as an editor. He had been a freelance writer. And he come on staff as an editor. I think, again, Jim Shooter was modeling the Marvel editorial staff to a large degree on the DC editorial staff of the 40s, 50s, 60s. So that
with separate compartments.
Separate departments, and even more so than DC had, that if a character had more than one title, would have those titles supervised by one editor, which made total sense. I mean, and it's amazing it took so long, you know, for
to do that.
Marvel to figure that out. Because I remember there was a period there would be, say, if you had 3 Spider-Man books, you had Amazing, Spectacular, and Marvel Team Up, there'd be 3 different editors working on those titles, and so it was hard to coordinate, even if everybody had the best of intentions, you just forget, or things.
Yeah, sure.
So I think when Shooter brought Tom on as an editor, that was part of a process of creating groups or families of titles that would be under one editor for each one. So Tom became the editor of all the Spider-Man titles, and then he was promoted to be Jim's executive editor, and I was promoted from assistant to full editor on the Spider-Man books for the first phase. I had Spider-Man at 2 different periods.
Right. And so you were kind of like the Mort Weisinger to Superman, you were that to Spider-Man, basically, in a way.
I guess, without some of the...
no Spider Dog.
Without some of Mort's well-known quirks.
That Mort had, yeah.
Yeah, so that, right, exactly. So, I would supervise Spider-Man's main titles, but of course being Spider-Man, like Wolverine or later the Punisher or whoever, people always wanted to guest star the character. So it was always a matter of, they, in theory, would have to get my approval, which couldn't be withheld unreasonably. You know, that was always especially in the 90s during the big comic book glut.
Yeah, X-Men and Spidey, yeah.
There's always a question, you know, like, what's too much? Is having Wolverine in 5 books this month going to dilute the character, or does it not matter, or does it just...
Right.
These are ongoing philosophical
questions,
and sales questions that at different times had different answers.
So when you started editing Spider-Man, were you thinking, okay, so Tom did it this way, I'm going to do it like that for a while, then you transitioned into your own style, or did you just come in kind of with your own idea of how you were going to kind of run the character?
Well, Tom had done a great job. You know, I think there are like a handful of people walking the planet who really understand who Spider-Man and Peter Parker are, and I think Tom is one of those people. Well, yeah, he was, you know, plus all his books were on or ahead of schedule. Yeah, I was terrified. You know, luckily there's a lot I didn't even know that I didn't know. You know, so I just wanted to keep the books going. And, you know, to say there's no such thing as walking into somebody else's editorial line and just keeping it going, because a lot of what keeps it going is the chemistry between the editor and the creative personnel.
Sure.
So once that chemistry changes, everything else changes. You can go in saying, I'm not going to change anything, and you don't have a choice about it. Things change. You know, because so much of editing is personal chemistry. You know, there are, as I've often said, so I'll say it again, I mean, there are people who think I'm the best editor they ever had, and there are people who think I'm the worst editor they ever had. Well, I'm the same guy. So there's got to be something about the relationship between
its relatives.
Me and that creative team that makes one person think I'm great and another think that I'm horrible. So that comes into play, and so there's so many intangibles involved. So I think what I felt my responsibility was to the character. I mean, obviously it was Jim Shooter who was writing my Raise reviews, but my responsibility was to take my understanding of who Peter Parker was and what made him tick, and what would be the best stories to make him relatable to the audience, and who would be the best people to do that. Because when I came on, I think Team Up didn't have a regular writer. Every freelance writer and artist on a comic has their own career, their own agenda, and their own family, and their own idea of what's right and what's appropriate and what they will accept in terms of suggestion and supervision. And it's so much about chemistry, that I know it seemed like a simple question, like, what was your intention? And, my intention was to make good comic books and to keep my job,
Yeah, right.
And hopefully those two things will require the same thing.
The same work, the amount of work, the same work. Was there a feeling like, okay, I want to update Peter Parker for this new audience, or was it more like organic and just kind of putting out Peter Parker stories? Because the context is probably different from the 60s and the 80s, right?
Right, say in the early, mid-'80s. I think even then, the bulk of people reading comics, especially Spider-Man, were kids,
Yeah.
So I tried to say to myself, if I was 10 or 12 now, what would I be looking for in a story, and what would make me come back the next issue?
Yeah.
What was it that made me as a kid keep coming back? What was it that made me stop when I stopped? And how do I work with the creative teams to do that? And that required understanding a lot of things, who Peter Parker was, what a Marvel comic is, what a reader expects from a Marvel comic, from a Spider-Man comic. So there's all these things going through your mind. I didn't have a grand vision of I must impose my wonderful self on Spider-Man. I wanted to keep these comics going and keep them good and keep them selling.
So was editing the Marvel Tales reprints with the classic 60s, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko Spider-Man, did that serve as kind of a professional review of Spider-Man's personality, of Peter Parker's personality, to get into the more current stuff?
That happened more for me in the British department when I was going through all those old comics with a fine-tooth comb and having to even split them up into chapters. But yeah, I think the Marvel Tales was partly that. I think I was looking to my template more to what Tom had done with Roger Stern and Bill Mantlo and John Romita Jr. and Al Milgrom.
Oh, okay.
Look, everything that Marvel Comics does and ever will do is informed by the first 50 issues of Spider-Man and the first 100 issues of Fantastic Four. Those are the Bible and the template and the handbook and the guidebook. And even if you've never read those comics, you go to the movies, and when the movies work, that's what they do. So in that sense, I had that stuff imprinted in my DNA, and so I was always looking to that. But I was also aware that that stuff, to most modern 12-year-olds, would read as dated and square.
Mm-hmm.
This was what Shooter and Grunwald and DeFalco were great at, was they reverse engineered the great Marvel comics and the great DC comics and the great literature. They figured out what a good English teacher figures out, or a good literary critic or movie critic figures out, is here's why we love this thing, here's what's appealing about this, here's why Hamlet is still relevant, and here's why Tom Sawyer is still relevant.
Reverse engineered makes sense.
They reveal something, even if it's something minor, but they give you some insight into, dare I say, the human condition.
Yeah, right.
Even the silliest, story gives you some insight, and then there's got to be a lot of cool hoo-ha action, as Tom would call it. And obviously it's a superhero comic book, so there's got to be punching and hitting and action and adventure, but there's got to be. So what those guys were really good at, and what I tried to take away from them, and I think I learned a lot and try to pass on when I teach or lecture, is what makes these tick? What is it that underneath all the surface glitz makes people, love Peter Parker, whether he's in the comic or whether he's in a cartoon or whether he's played by Tobey Maguire or who's the kid playing him in the current movies?
Tom Holland.
Here's the thing. I noticed this in the first week I was in comics, right? Comics are, superhero fantasies are at a certain level about might making right and achieving noble goals through violence. And I know a lot of people don't like that as a message, including a lot of my friends and people I've known my whole life. And yet, when I told them I was working in Marvel Comics and working on Spider-Man, almost uniformly, everyone went, "Oh, that's really cool." Even
because Spider-Man doesn't come off like that. Spider-Man seems to be always on the defense, right?
Right, and people have a warm, fuzzy feeling about Marvel Comics in general. Even before the phenomenon of the movies and TV shows, even when it was a more esoteric kind of thing. I mean, it was just cool. Most people just thought it was a cool thing and interesting and offbeat, and, whereas, say, somebody might find, like, the Death Wish movies about a guy who goes out and shoots everybody.
Right. That's clearly different.
Yeah, and yet the message in many ways is the same. If you have the power to affect justice as you see it, then,
to correct social things,
then you're the hero, at least.
How'd you feel Ron Frenz when he did Spidey? Did you feel like he kind of summoned some of that Ditko vibe, and then how do you feel he did on the character?
Oh, Ron is Ron. I mean, Ron has a lot of influences that he displays proudly, but I think he synthesizes them into, his own distinct vision and point of view and gestalt, dare I say. I mean, Ron is the greatest. Ron is the ultimate, Marvel Comics artist in a really good way. He's... for sure. He gets the characters. He's a thinking artist. Very often, pretty much when he and Tom work together, they pretty much co-plot the stories, they talk out the characters. I can't say enough great things about him.
Yeah, he's good. So now tell us about writing the Howard the Duck movie adaptation comic.
That was a pure money grab.
Uh-huh.
I needed work. There was an assignment. I still have never seen the movie.
That's hilarious.
Well, you write these things. They give you a version of the script and a lot of production stills, and then there you go. So it was.
Did you put your own take on Howard in there, or bend it to the comics in any way?
No, I just pretty much went by the screen.
By the script and the pictures.
I think the first movie adaptation I'd ever.
That you'd worked on, okay.
I'd been involved with doing a lot of the research for the Xanadu Super Special, but that was more for the articles.
Mm-hmm.
You had done Dragon Slayer, too.
I didn't write that. I was just...
but I mean, you got to edit the credit on that.
So these things, these are just... I did some of the articles.
From a writing perspective, how did you feel about Howard the Duck as far as Steve Gerber's version versus Bill Mantlow's? How did you feel about those two versions? Or did you read them?
Look, I guess there are people who say they should have stopped Spider-Man after Ditko left,
Yeah, right.
Obviously, history has proven those people wrong. I do think maybe there was no point in doing Howard the Duck after Gerber left. Bill was a professional, and he had a pretty good sense of humor, and, those stories were fine. But there was something about that character and Steve Gerber and Gene Colan and Tom Palmer. There was something about, and the time, the fact that when it came out, that made it a special thing, and I don't think that's a particularly radical opinion, but it's also... I know that Steve did a couple of miniseries in the 90s, I think, the early 2000s that I did not read.
Like Fool Killer, which is pretty good.
Yeah, but I think he did like a Howard the Duck miniseries or two.
It never worked again. I think it was a zeitgeist thing, and it worked at the time that he first did it.
Yeah, again, he was at whatever age he was. He lived in New York at the depth of New York's decay, and even Cleveland, where Howard ended up, was sort of at the nadir. It was really a lot of what Steve did reflected its times, which was really this era when government and society almost seemed to have given up on America's cities, and Howard really voiced a lot of the angst and insanity of urban life at the time. Steve was living in Times Square when Times Square was at its meanest, and most depraved. So I think all that filtered through his consciousness. I worked with him years later on Cloak and Dagger, which I thought he did some brilliant work on.
Oh, cool. Mm-hmm.
That was in the 90s.
So now you edited the Marvel Saga books in 1986. Would you refer to Grunwald or Sanderson, like saying, hey, basically kind of getting reminded on continuity when you were working on that book? Tell us about that. And I actually grew up on Marvel Saga personally. I was in school reading Marvel Saga thinking, oh my gosh, this has been going on all this time? My God.
Yeah, well, Marvel Saga was interesting. I was a freelancer at the time, and I needed some work to do. I wasn't doing as much writing as I needed to do, so took this on as a freelance editing job, and it sort of came with Peter Sanderson as the writer. That was part of the deal. Mm-hmm. And I think we'd go to Grunwald or Shooter or even to, say, George Olszewski's guides or the Universe Handbook It was funny. I loved working on it. You know, it appealed to the scholar and historian in me to sort of put this stuff in chronological order.
Nice.
You know, I think in retrospect, or even I think I knew it at the time, this was the classic conflict between art and commerce.
Mm-hmm.
When Shooter gave me the assignment, I said, is this a mini-series or an ongoing series? And I fully thought he'd say, well, make it a 12-issue limited series. But he didn't. He said it's ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Peter and I were both freelancers. So therefore, we're going to keep the thing going as long as we can. You know, I mean, it's even though in both of our heart of hearts, I mean, you'd have to ask Peter, but I think we both thought, well, this would probably be better to have a finite beginning and end, so we know that we have to fit all of Marvel history in X number of pages. But it didn't. So, you know, I think we may have given a little more space to stories that maybe we sentimentally were attached to. I mean, we probably didn't need to give as much space to Thug Thatcher as we did. You know, although again, I did get to make up that Thug Thatcher's given name was Thelonious, you know, which I think Walt Simonson, you know, because I was hanging around the office and Walt would often come in, and I told him I was joking with him about, oh yeah, we're doing Thug Thatcher, and I gave him a name, Thelonious, you know. I think that's what inspired Walt to even bring Thug Thatcher back in his Thor run.
Oh, that's funny.
Just us sitting around and joking about the character.
These are good descriptive names, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a thing, and it's like an homage to Thelonious Monk, of course. You know, it was. So Peter and I had a lot of fun. I got to, you know, it's when I got to be very good friends with Peter, who's, you know, just like an amazing person. This is one of, of course, the funny things about working in comics. Altogether, it's the classic thing. You're sitting in a diner. Hey, when you're working in comics, especially as a freelancer, you get to know where the diners are, where they won't throw you out after an hour. Mm-hmm. You get to know where you can sit for 3 hours, and actually, but you find yourself sitting in a restaurant, you know, plotting, you know, talking about plotting to kill people or blow stuff up or destroy the world, and you get funny looks from the tables around you. So Peter and I would have these long conversations about, you know, would Loki do this? And when Loki was trapped as a tree and he was able to, there's some story where Loki made a tree cry, you know. While Peter and I liked having an ongoing series to work on, we certainly were not looking to pad it out. So the Crimson Beetle, or whatever the character's name was one of Ant-Man's earliest villains, but he is kind of silly by 1980s standards. So how do we deal with a character like that? And, you know, yeah, it was just a lot of fun. And Peter and I always had a good time, just kind of, there are worse things than getting paid to, like, you know, iron out the wrinkles in Marvel history, you know.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. That sounds like fun work. So then, before Jim Shooter left to be replaced by Tom DeFalco as editor-in-chief, you worked on some 1986, 1987 New Universe titles as a scripter.
Difficult. I was the writer of Psi-Force. It was fun working with Mark Texeira, who was great. He really, even then, just brought wonderful visual power and drama to Psi-Force. There were numerous reasons where there would be different rewrites or revisions. But it was good. I enjoyed it because although it was in the New Universe, it could still be taken seriously. You know, say Dazzler, I think had a hard time being taken seriously, no matter how much gravitas we tried to instill it with. But Psi-Force was a good sort of hybrid, in a way, almost, of Spider-Man and Darkhawk, which I'd later go to do. It was you know, I mean, I was already in my 30s at that point, so I wasn't a teenager, but I felt immature enough to still be in touch with my teenage side.
Teenage side, yeah.
So it was fun. You know, I had some issues with some editorial decisions, but I was glad to have the work. And
I see.
You know, I like those characters. And I say Tex really made it a pleasure. I did an issue, I think, with Bob Hall, who's become a good friend.
Yeah.
You may be seeing a project from him and me somewhere down the line.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I like Bob Hall.
Yeah, again, I don't know if I have any rollicking stories, but it felt like it was good, solid. You know, it was the New Universe, but, you know, we tried to give it the best of Marvel, which was angst-laced adventures of teenagers who despite all their problems and all their being hunted, right, were still having fun. Because, I mean, I think that's the essence. If you drill down in Marvel overall, I mean, starting with Spider-Man, but going out to almost all the characters, at some level it's fun to be this character. At some level, you're still the person web-swinging across New York or flying across country or lifting a mountain. I mean, at some point, that's fun.
Yeah, living vicariously through the writing, for sure.
Yeah, no matter what else may be going on and who you're in love with who hates you or who you're indebted to that's dying or who's trying to kill you, it's still fun to be a Marvel character, and I think we tried to maintain all those kind of Marvel touchstones in Psi-Force.
Yeah. So when you were doing this, was this written in like Marvel style of plotting, then dialoguing, or was it like you wrote a whole script out?
Most of the comics I wrote at Marvel were done Marvel style.
Marvel style, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, that had evolved. I guess that got its name with Stan and Jack did, where either they'd have a very brief plot conference or a half-page description, or Jack would plot it himself, and Stan would then change the story with his dialogue. By the time I got there, it had evolved where writers would write a reasonably detailed description, just not the dialogue. You'd have what you'd call almost a story synopsis. You'd say the story, it opens with this on the splash page. We tried to write the plots almost as if you were sitting telling the story to a friend.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of imagine that the artist was that friend you're sitting across a diner table from and saying this happens and that happens. So, and then it got certain writers would write tons of detail, others would write less, but it was rarely page 1, something happens to Sue, to Sue Storm, page 2, the Fantastic Four look for her, page 3, the 15, they fight Dr. Doom. I mean, it was never, it was never that. It was Marvel style or Marvel method plot first, but the plots almost always had a certain level of detail to them, just not all the dialogue.
Right. Now, what was your impression of the New Universe stories, and why did it not last?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think in retrospect, which is, I guess, the only way you can really...
Right. Analyze it.
It seemed odd then, and it seems... Right, I get the idea that to celebrate Marvel's 25th anniversary, you would want to come up with something that in the Marvel tradition is new and status quo shattering.
Right.
But the fact is you can't do that on demand or on command. And so it did and does seem, although I understand the reasoning behind it, that you would celebrate Marvel's 25th anniversary by doing something not involved with any of Marvel's characters.
Right.
Marvel's well-known characters. Because, I mean, I think if you read the stories, it's like a lot of things that get pilloried in history, I mean, certainly to jump ahead a decade or so, a couple of decades, the idea that the Clone Saga stories are now being repackaged in 100 different formats, including omnibuses, is, you could have knocked me over with a feather at the time, and we can talk about that more later or next time, but I think there were many good people working on those books, including Archie Goodwin and Tom DeFalco and Mark Texeira, and the list goes on. John Romita Jr., Shooter himself. The Starbrand books were very clever and very innovative. I just think got off on the wrong track. I think there was no one character that caught people's imaginations,
And it was kind of dystopian, right? I mean, it was kind of a dystopian...
It ended up that way for numerous reasons. It didn't... Even the most quote-unquote realistic, superhero comic, knowing what we know of human nature, that's sort of the Watchmen fallacy. Sort of people took the brilliance of Watchmen and took it as kind of a...
There you go.
As not just an outlier, but as like an example, as a template. So it's like, yes, if people got superpowers, they probably would act like the people in Watchmen. People are selfish. Even the most idealistic people often act out of selfish motives, or they screw up, they hurt other people, or blow stuff up inadvertently. So I guess when the New Universe started heading in that direction, and the rule, at least in the beginning, of course, that ended up being violated after Jim was gone, the idea was no aliens, no magic, no subsea secret or races.
So there are some limits there.
I think it was heading in that sort of dystopic way. And then they ended up doing that stuff with the draft and the war. I was gone from the books by that point. Again, I get why they did that. I never thought that was a great idea. It sort of fulfilled certain emotional catharsis needed by people because of various things going on at Marvel, that you can read between the lines and figure out. I think, say, if Starbrand or Psi-Force, if any of them had caught on in a big way, I mean, the same thing happened with the Ultimate Marvel universe.
Yeah.
Where I think everybody thought, and it made perfect sense, that that would become the mainstream comic book Marvel universe, but it didn't. You know, I think there's something so powerful about those characters that Stan, Jack, and Steve came up with, and Larry came up with. You know, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, even beyond that, that Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman are still, you know,
the central characters. Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you said to a kid in 1947, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, they know what you. That's kind of wild that those characters, despite the thousands of other characters that both companies have come up with, that the ones that came from that first primal explosion of creativity at both those companies are still have outlasted in the public consciousness any other character, just, I think, because they were first.
Yeah, that's true. Now, when DeFalco became editor-in-chief in '87, did you feel like, okay, I'm familiar with his style? Was it a pretty smooth transition from Jim Shooter's? And did their managerial style, were they different?
Sorry. He chortled. Yes. Luckily for me, I had gone freelance in late '84. I felt I was ancient. I was 30 years old. I couldn't imagine being older than that. And I really felt I needed to take some risks in my life. And so I went freelance. But I had a standing offer from both Shooter and DeFalco that any time I wanted to come back on staff, I could.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Beats the poke in the eye with a sharp stick, you know. And so I eventually did that a couple of years into Tom's reign. You know, being a freelancer has its ups and downs, as perhaps you know, the kind of, in a sense, you're never on duty, and in a sense, you're always on duty. If your kid needs you to do something, then you can go do it, but you might be up till 4 a.m. making up the lost time that whatever that cool thing you did with your kid was, you know. Shooter, for whatever reasons, had become very hands-on as an editor-in-chief. You've read, or your listeners can read, the various articles about things going on, and there was a lot of conflict, you know, at Marvel, between Jim and the editors, between Jim and the executives. You know, you can read his blog. He's got his own point of view on the story. I was actually freelancing at that point, so I was not in the office day to day. So there's a lot of stuff that I think that I'm, to this day, not really aware of. DeFalco was brought in. I think Tom thought that if they did fire Jim, they'd fire him too, because he was Jim's right-hand man.
Oh, I see.
But they didn't. They brought him in as chief. Yeah. Look, Tom was a terrific manager. He understood the characters. He knew the company. And I think he also knew that people needed more freedom than they'd had, that they needed the freedom to experiment and make mistakes. Tom was as big a Spider-Man traditionalist as you can get, and yet it was under his reign that Todd McFarlane came in with, you know, that radically different look and the different look for the webbing. I think Tom understood that sometimes you can, even if you know you're right, you still have to let people do what they're going to do in order to keep morale up and to just sort of keep the creative electricity going. So I think that was a big kind of reaction to the very regimented way things have been. And Tom just had a very different style. Tom, I think, is one of the great geniuses of the comics industry of recent years. You know, and again, not that I've agreed with every decision Tom made regarding me or regarding his reign, but overall, he was
overall was good,
more than good. Overall,
yeah, right.
He was a guy, you know, who you really wanted to please and do stuff for, because, you know, again, he's human, but you always felt that what he was doing was for the sake of the characters and of the ultimate health of the medium and the company and the characters.
I have a question. Could he have done anything that would have stopped the migration of the top artists there over to Image, or was that just inevitable?
That was inevitable. I think, again, history and the marketplace came together where that generation of creators looked at history, you know. I mean, they looked at comics history, they looked at Siegel and Schuster, they looked at Jack Kirby, you know, they looked at their childhood idols and the guys who built the business, and they even looked at their immediate predecessors, right? And then Marvel gave them the means, and really Paul Levitz at DC and Jim Shooter at Marvel pushed for these royalty programs. Mm-hmm. So these guys now had a lot of money.
Right.
But they were smart enough to figure out, we're hot now, but we're not always going to be hot.
Yeah, I see.
We need to build something that's ours.
So those incentive plans in the 80s actually was one of these ingredients that actually caused this image revolution. That's
totally
interesting.
Totally financed it, yeah. Because the generation before that had bought cool stuff for themselves and their families,
right.
Which you can't fault them for. They bought nice homes and they bought stuff for their kids and their wives. And the Image guys did that too, but I think it was largely McFarlane and to some degree Rob. That's my kind of view of it as an outsider. Yeah, Todd McFarlane's not working for anybody. Todd McFarlane's a born entrepreneur.
Yes.
And very smart. I think they had just seen too much of history and seen people who were riding high one day who the next year were, calling up some 12-year-old begging for work, and they didn't want to be guys doing that, So.
Right. No, that's right. So now let's talk a little bit about, in 1990, a lot of things start off in Marvel. You really kind of get ingrained back into Marvel pretty deep at this point. You're editing New Warriors, Spider-Man, Moon Knight from, 90 to 95, but Spidey started in 91. And these were kind of street-level vigilante-type characters. Is that a particular knack you have for that type of content? Do you like that more than cosmic stories, for example?
It's funny because you guys know all about comics, so this is a funny question. Basically, I had that standing offer from Shooter and then from DeFalco, if you want to come back, we'll be glad to have you back. So I had been freelancing for, I think, 5 years for various personal things going on in my life for me to have a day job again. So I came back. So I said to Tom, I'd like to come back. And the books that were available then were Moon Knight, Alpha Flight, Cloak and Dagger.
Right.
I think because Carl Potts, maybe was promoted to be the Epic Comics.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
The Epic Comics. So I took over his books, and then New Warriors was a book they wanted to start, and there were probably one or two others that I'm forgetting, and a bunch of graphic novels. So that was in mid-'89, actually. So I guess a lot of those titles didn't hit the stands. So
yeah.
It's funny, because when I went freelance in late '84, I said to myself, I'm taking a chance here. I feel I have to, but even if I do go back on staff, now that they've instituted editors' royalties, I'll never see those Spider-Man books again. That'll just never happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no way. So I came back and I got sort of these low-selling, quirky books.
Like Alpha Flight.
Alpha Flight, Moon Knight, Cloak and Dagger, New Warriors, which New Warriors was a joke. Before I put Fabian and Bagley on it, the concept of New Warriors was kind of like Dazzler for the 90s.
Oh, really? So when they premiered in those 2 Thor issues, they were kind of a joke kind of team.
There was an in-house gag for New Warriors, and the tagline was, Marvel Comics, if you didn't buy them, we couldn't print them.
Huh.
Specifically referring to the New Warriors. So I had this line of titles that I thought all those books needed changes, and I thought there was nothing to lose. And I had just gone through a divorce, so I was pissed off in general. So I really became the nightmare overbearing editor and pretty much imposed my personality on all those books because I thought they really all needed a shot in the arm.
Nice, okay.
And you know what? That's how you're an editor. That's what you do. You do this.
Yeah.
That thing about you hire the best people and let them go, total bullshit. So anyway, it's like Bender playing God in that Futurama episode. If you do your job right, nobody will know you've done anything. Again, I'm being facetious to make a point, but in this case, I just said, these books aren't selling much. They're all on the verge of cancellation. Let's shake them up. So funny that you asked me that about the Spider-Man book, so I took in a way the exact opposite approach with those books.
Right.
Because I just felt, who gives a shit what happens to Cloak and Dagger, Moon Knight, and Alpha Flight? I mean, even if I totally fuck up royalty, who's gonna know?
Right, and that's actually kind of right.
Yeah, which is the best attitude to go in. That's where
it is.
I looked at Moon Knight and I said, wow, here's a guy. He's a Jew who'll do anything for money. Wow. Wow, that's pretty intense. He's got 11 different origins, even though the people who invented him, and I believe Doug Mensch really meant well by making him Jewish and doing all he did with him, so I don't impute any ill will on the people who worked on it before. But I'm looking at that and I'm going, here's a Jew who'll do anything for money, and I have this deep Jewish background. What the fuck do I do with this series? So that's when I said about the trial of Mark Spector. I said, well, somehow there's got to be a reckoning, you know. Even if he's like the world's nicest mercenary, somewhere he killed somebody. Somewhere he killed an innocent. Somewhere bad shit happened.
Right.
So that's where I came up with the trial of Mark Spector, you know. And
I like it.
I don't know if Chuck liked it or not, but he played along and he did it. Did a good job on it. And
yeah, is that a manifestation of Jewish guilt?
I guess it was probably autobiographical by me. Operating control through Chuck, you know. So it really disturbed me, you know. I mean, this often happens. How many times have we seen like comics trying, or movies too, trying to kind of do something progressive, you know, and inclusive, and it ends up just reinforcing the worst cliches about whatever ethnic or racial group or religious group they're dealing with.
Sure. No, that's true. Yeah.
You know, Alpha Flight I didn't know what to do with. You know, again, that's maybe a thing they should have canceled after Byrne left it. Anyway, so the Cloak and Dagger, that's when I put Gerber on Cloak and Dagger. You know, I ended up putting Fabian and Bagley on New Warriors, and they turned out to be this team that, you know, I'd worked with Bagley before on some other projects, so I knew him. He and I did that What If together, What If Spider-Man's Living Costume.
I like that story. I love that What If, yeah.
Me too, thank you. And he was the artist on, what was that Outer Space Commando thing that I was editing? Because I inherited that from Carl also. Strike Force Morituri. He was the artist on Strike Force Morituri, and we, you know, one thing in any efficiency we gain with the internet, one thing we've lost is, you know, long telephone calls like this, you know.
Yeah,
which I would have. I mean, part of your job as an editor at Marvel, and I'm sure everywhere, was to spend long conversations with artists and writers who needed such, you know, that kind of thing. You play whatever, and very often you get to know their families because you'd call and you get their wife or their kid and you'd have a long conversation. So, I knew Bagley pretty well. He became a good friend. Fabian I knew from the office, and Fabian was very ambitious and very talented, had a million ideas, which I guess the good and bad news with Fabian was that you had to try to figure out which were the good ideas and which were the bad ideas, you know.
But I love the work you did on New Warriors. I mean, I read every issue as it came out. I couldn't wait for the next month. I mean, I loved it.
Those guys were great to work with, but I would say, and you know, I mean, in a good way, that Fabian and I had a lot of shouting matches over plots where he'd want to do some crazy thing, and I go, that's great, you know, or he'd think what I would want to do would be much too conservative or careful, and I think what he would want to do would be too reckless and made no sense but it worked out. It was especially those first 25 issues were just wonderful. So thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of those. Again, I'm not sure I've answered your question, but that was sort of, again, I felt like New Warriors was another book you had nothing to lose. You know, everybody expected it to fail, so if it failed, no one would be surprised, and everybody will be pleasantly surprised by it. B, it looks good on your resume too.
Yeah, but those first 26 issues were magic, though. Yeah, I do feel that way. In 1991, then you started editing Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man. So the artist that was first on when you kind of got re-signed back to Spider-Man was Erik Larsen. How was working with him? How were those pages?
Erik is great. Professional, imaginative. You know, one thing I found about the Image guys, including Todd, Erik especially, was that they didn't seem to take things personally. You know, they were careful to not burn bridges, which was very interesting. They went out to compete with Marvel, but look, except for Todd, they've all been back working for Marvel. They were adult enough to know that they didn't want to or need to burn bridges. So Erik, I mean, he was good, he was fast, he was imaginative, work was full of energy.
He knew how to write.
He knew how to write, exactly. You know, he
can pace a story,
Yeah.
So then when he left to co-create Image Comics, were you the one that recommended Mark Bagley to come on to Spider-Man after that?
I think Bagley would have killed me if I hadn't hired him to do Spider-Man. That was, I think there were those death threats from Bagley that were highly. I'm just kidding, Mark. You know, but not that much. Yeah, well, Bagley had done. You know, I'd seen his Spider-Man. I think. Right.
And you'd done New Warriors already by then.
Done New Warriors, done Spider-Man. He and I had done the What If. I think he'd done some fill-in Spidey stories for Salad Crop. It was. I think we talked about it a lot. I knew that he wanted it, and he was a workhorse. Not only was he good, but he could draw a lot of pages.
Yeah, and he was doing Spidey and New Warriors at the same time for some of that. And you guys even did a crossover between the two books as far as New Warriors and Spidey. And so how was coordinating that?
Well, it was easy because it was all coming out of my office.
Was that your idea to cross them over?
You mean the round robin story?
Yeah.
That was a story that I had come up with for Moon Knight.
Uh-huh.
I think maybe I'd even pitched it as a miniseries that I would write. I forget, and again, it's all kind of vague.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, we were doing the bi-weeklies. Spider-Man had the bi-weeklies, and
right.
I think David needed a break. So I gave my outline for that to Al Milgrom to write, Al's a terrific writer, besides being a great pencil and inker. So Al, it's always fun to do it in your own office. I mean, you may have noticed that when I wrote Darkhawk, I had Spider-Man guest starring quite a bit in.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you had Darkhawk and Moon Knight they're all hanging out together, these guys.
And also we did a mini-series a few years later, the Spider-Man Friends and Enemies.
Yeah.
When I came back on staff, I found one reason I'd gone freelance in '84 was I had sort of gotten books coming out regularly, and I thought they were good, but in a way I had found people I trusted and could let them go, so I was a little bored, so aside from wanting to kind of establish my own voice more as a writer, I was also a little bored, so I'd found ways when I came back on staff in '89 to make it more interesting for myself. Hard to describe exactly what, because obviously I couldn't. As I had said facetiously before, yes, there were some books that I imposed my will on. This is what we're doing, but I couldn't and didn't want to do that, especially with the Spidey books, if I didn't have to. I mean, that became complicated as the Spider line grew to like 18 monthly titles. But I found ways to keep it more interesting for myself. And so coming back to Spidey, I think I understood better who the character was. I understood the history of the character in depth. One thing I'd done a lot of, with the Marvel Saga and just with writing a lot of different characters was really immersing myself in the history in a way that I maybe hadn't before and writing all those what-ifs. Again, I've lost track of the question.
But you're creating great context, which we love. Another thing, the creation of Carnage, right? The whole Carnage saga. Was that character directed by you to them, or did that come from more writing? How did Carnage come about?
The idea for it started when Salicrup was still editing the Spider-Man books. Again, I'm sure I probably once knew more of the detail. Look, obviously Venom was incredibly popular. Right. So to do something that was a riff on Venom but wasn't exactly the same character became Carnage. So I don't know if it was David or Jim or a combination of the two of them, but somehow the idea became, well, what if we gave a Venom-like suit to the Joker? I guess, who was that level of crazy? Who was that chaotic and destructive and nihilistic in his view of life? That was mostly in place by the time I took the books back over. So that was David and I guess Erik and of course Mark really did the finishing. Mark Bagley did the finishing touches on the visual. Oh, I see.
So David was already toying with the idea of this character before, and then Erik had kind of fleshing out a little bit of it, and Mark kind of finalized that. I see what you're saying.
Right, and the name actually was Eric Fine, who was my assistant at the time, came up with the name of Carnage.
Of Cletus Cassidy? Oh, of the actual Carnage character.
Yeah. No, Cletus Cassidy was in place already, but the name Carnage, and obviously I approved it, and David Michelinie approved it.
You were editing Spider-Man, but also writing Darkhawk, and Darkhawk was under a different editor, is that right?
Yeah, the policy at Marvel in those days was not only could staff people, not only were they allowed to do freelance work, but they were encouraged to do freelance work. So I was writing Darkhawk, and let's see, the first editor I think had been maybe Greg Wright, and then it had been Howard Mackey, and then Nelson Yumtov. So yeah, it was the theory was that you couldn't be your own editor, but so somebody else on the staff would have to edit. Anyway, so that's how that worked.
I know that's different from like the 70s when, people like Marv Wolfman could edit and write, like Dracula, for example. So was it weird for you to kind of have your own editor, but then you also edited other books? Did you ever disagree with their editorial decisions?
It was a surreal kind of thing because, it was that kind of classic comics industry incestuous kind of thing where you'd be editing somebody and somebody else would be editing. I guess when it was just sort of a cross, if the person you were editing was at the same corporate structure level as you were, it was generally not a big deal. I guess when it got weird would be when, say, you'd be editing somebody much higher or much lower than you in the structure. So And to his credit, say, Tom DeFalco never pulled rank. Tom was in many ways the perfect freelancer. Not only would Tom not be a prima donna and not say, I won't do this, I won't do that, but he was such a perfectionist that he'd often do his own rewrites before you even got to edit the thing. You know, he was concerned for the quality of the story and so on. But it's obviously there are potential pitfalls when the person who has the power to evaluate your job performance is suddenly, not suddenly, but is also someone working for you as a freelancer. And in the history of comics, this is pretty much starting with Martin Goodman, you know, hiring half of his relatives to be on staff, including Stan. I mean, I guess that whole thing, people having multiple and possibly conflicting relationships is pretty much a comic industry tradition. It could be weird, but I'd say most of the time it worked out. I would say there were never glitches or never, you know, I mean, that was certainly a lesson to me when I went freelance for that period in the late 80s, when I kind of, you know, saw that I sort of took a calculated risk. I decided I wanted to do this, and you know, I learned that just because someone is your friend and your lunch buddy and whatever doesn't necessarily guarantee they're going to give you work. That was a kind of eye-opening lesson in reality for me, you know. Although by the same token, I think there were also maybe, you know, assignments I got because I was somebody's buddy or was somebody they'd known a long time. Probably similar to going into business with relatives, because comics, especially in the 80s and 90s, was very incestuous in the best possible way.
I like that. Incest in a good way. Yeah. The most positive form of incest.
As a Southerner, I just want to speak up and say yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Jim knows about that. Did you have fun building the Darkhawk character?
That was a hell of a lot of fun. You know, the character, you know, came from like a skeletal outline that Tom DeFalco wrote. It was maybe 3 or 4 double-spaced type pages, and so the basic framework was there, but there was tons of stuff that needed to be filled in, and I remember developed a lot of it with Greg Wright, who then I think maybe he went freelance, and then it went to Howard. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, because sort of I knew that the mandate was sort of Spider-Man for the 90s, you know.
Right.
So he was a teenage kid, and he even went to Midtown High, which was still in Queens at that time, you know. If you know your New York geography, you know, Forest Hills is nowhere near Midtown. I was able to bring changes on the basic outline. So I think in the original outline, if you know your Darkhawk, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but the original outline, it was sort of a classic comic book thing where his father gets killed when Chris finds the amulet, and so Chris vows to get revenge on the people who killed his father and on crime in general. So I was kind of proud of the different angle I brought to that, where he actually saw what looked like his father taking a payoff from some gangsters. I thought that added an extra angle. Like here, his dad had taught him his whole life to do the right thing.
Right.
And then he sees his father taking a payoff, and then the guy disappears, you know. So, spoiler alert, later on it turned out there was more to it than that, but I kind of patted myself on the back. I thought that was a clever thing to bring to it. It's like, here's this guy who instills in you a set of values, then sort of you see him betraying them, those values, and then what do? How do you live your life, especially if you get an amulet that gives you superpowers, right?
Right.
I think that's actually, in a way, almost a classic Marvel thing where everything is not black and white, where suddenly there's this extra complication that happens in real life. I mean, how many times, you know, as you get older, you look back on your life or your parents' life or other people, you know, you go, okay, this person had this set of beliefs, but then they did this thing that really went against them. Why would they do that? What is it about real life that makes people have to compromise their beliefs? So, I mean, I thought that was one of the things I'm proudest of that series, was that angle on it. And then it was just fun sort of building up the relationship with his family and with the kids at school and so on. There was that one story, it's funny, Mike Manley's been posting some artwork on Facebook lately that reminded me of the story where there's like a big hostage situation at his high school, and Chris has to rescue the kids and so on. It was fun just to do a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. So now, as you're ending your run at Darkhawk, which was a long run, then this kind of goes into the end of your time at Marvel. So some of the things that were happening at the time, there's a lot of weird corporate decisions being made. Marvel was declaring bankruptcy shortly after. Mark Gruenwald died from, a lot of people think, the stress and his heart defect that he was born with. And you leave Marvel around this time. So can you tell us about what led you to leave? Did you feel like the ship was sinking and it's time to leave? What happened?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, the way you just sort of gave that list, and if you look at a calendar, then, your reading is valid in that a lot of these things sort of happened one on top of the other. In my experience of it was a lot more drawn out. In other words, yes, between 94 and 96, looking back from the perspective of 2019, that's a short period. But when you're living it, man, oh man, it seems to be taking a lot.
Right.
It's slow motion, if anything. It's not speeded up. So a question that I sometimes get asked, and that I'll ask myself here because I think it's relevant to your question. Mm-hmm. Someone will ask me, what was it like at Marvel in the 80s and 90s? Which, was a really general question, and mm-hmm. generally I prefer more specific ones. But the answer I give is we thought we beat the system.
Right.
Like if you look at the Marvel editorial roster from, from 1980 to 1995, it doesn't change a whole lot. So there are some times where maybe if somebody leaves staff, they don't replace them. But Marvel was fairly stable in that period. Mm-hmm. And our joke used to be, boy, how badly do you have to screw up to get fired in this place? I mean, people it seemed like a pretty secure thing. And it seemed like, especially you go, wow, we beat the system. We've been working, say I or several other people of my generation or my era, we've been working here for 15 years, and with editorial royalties and writers or artist royalties, we're earning like lawyers without having to go to law school.
Yeah, I mean, that was sweet.
Yeah, so we really thought we beat the system, and then we realized we were totally deluding ourselves. Because I think what had happened is that both Shooter and DeFalco saw part of their mission as protecting their editorial staff from corporate ups and downs. Mm-hmm. So they saw themselves and acted as lead shields from corporate. Because I think I may have mentioned this last time, which is a thing, when you're a fan or when you're starting out in comics, the editor-in-chief of Marvel seems like, like God manifest on earth. What could be a higher position? Well, it turns out the editor-in-chief of Marvel is middle management. Right? Right. There's numerous corporate levels above that person. So there was I think sort of the trigger event of everything that happened was when Marvel bought Heroes World, and decided to put all the distribution mm-hmm. With that company, and that backfired. Because there was this glut of comics from all companies, and I think Marvel was putting out, 120 comics a month at that point. Mm-hmm. But people, for whatever reason, people were generally buying them. Sales were slowly declining. And then that Heroes World debacle just broke the supply chain. Mm. And there have been things brewing in the upper corporate levels, I think having to do with the stock price and a lot of other stuff that I vaguely understand, but the chain was broken of supply, the spell. I figure there's a constant ratio of great and medium and terrible comics, but when you're putting out 120 a month, then even if 10% of them aren't very good, that's still mm-hmm. whatever percentage
it's still good comics. Yeah.
So I think that was part of what happened, and then of course that all got mixed in with the Clone Saga controversy, which increased Spider-Man sales and profits mm-hmm. and company profits, but it was obviously controversial. So all this stuff happened, and Darkhawk was declining in sales, so that was canceled. I was also doing a mini-series then, Spider-Man Friends and Enemies, which mm-hmm. had Darkhawk, Spider-Man, Nova, and Speedball, because each of them was a Spider-Man of their era. So all this stuff happened, and then suddenly Tom DeFalco was no longer the chief. The corporate folks sort of pushed him aside. He didn't leave his office, even though he was no longer chief. Mm-hmm. He didn't leave his office because I think he had various reasons for not wanting to leave the premises, and the corporate people didn't want him to leave because I think having him there would give the illusion of stability. So it was a totally surreal period where Tom is in his office. We're all, a lot of us are still going to him for advice on what the hell's going on, but he has no actual authority as chief anymore. He's just he's a freelancer, mm-hmm. Occupying this office, but things pretty much changed overnight. There was what was called a restructuring, which was very popular in corporations in the 90s, and I think still is, where my title didn't change, my salary didn't change, but everything changed around me. And suddenly, I had a different boss who, for numerous reasons, I didn't get along with. Tom was no longer my boss. So I started looking, they had what was called the Marvolution, if you remember that phrase. And the mascot for the Marvolution was the Spider-Man clone. That was considered the most exciting thing going on at the company. So the Ben Reilly Spider-Man, when they had the big meeting announcing the Marvolution, the big visual was this huge picture of the sweatshirt Spider-Man, the Scarlet Spider. So I was pretty much ready to quit that day. It just really was very, I don't know if you've ever gone through a corporate thing, corporate restructuring, but for me, and I think for a lot of people, next to like the death of a loved one or the end of a romantic relationship, I would say this was the most unpleasant and intense thing that ever happened to me. Was that day, that restructuring. Oh wow! And a lot of people. I mean, and I got a lot of mixed messages because I think even corporate and management and nobody really agreed what the future should be for the company. They've sort of done this drastic thing. I think it was a lot of people trying to protect their jobs at various corporate levels. And cooler heads prevailed and convinced me not to walk out, but I started looking around, and I'd known Byron Preiss because he was doing, his company had the license for the Marvel short stories and novels, so I was consulting on the Spider-Man related stuff. So I knew Byron, and there were some other ways I had known Byron or people close to him. He kind of offered me this job running this new division called Virtual Comics, which was part of his Byron Preiss multimedia company, which was different than his Byron Preiss visual publications, although they operated out of the same headquarters and so on. So it took me a couple of months to work out a deal with Byron, and I still wasn't sure what was going to happen at Marvel, and there were several rounds of layoffs, and I did not get laid off. They wanted me to stay there, but I could see it was only a matter of time. And I look back and I go, well, there were like 3 or 4 rounds of layoffs, and maybe they would have kept me on, or maybe they wouldn't have. Byron gave me an opportunity to go somewhere, to still be involved with comics, to be on the, and to be able to say, haha, I'm going to the cutting edge of the internet, So all those things sort of happened at once. Look, I guess Mark, so that was by 96, I think maybe it was early 96 when there was a big round of layoffs. Mark very closely identified with the company. I guess he did have, did they find out he had a genetic, because I know both his parents had heart problems. So I imagine he was predisposed to that. But certainly the stress of the Marvolution and all the aftermath obviously didn't help. Mark really so closely identified with we all identify with the company because many of us had grown up there, and it had many of the aspects of a family, and we really had deluded ourselves into thinking that we were sort of immune from corporate and economic realities, and then it, as it often does in that situation, it changed overnight. So it was a funny thing. I went over to Byron Preiss. Part of the reason I was there was to recruit, Marvel staff to do, Marvel freelancers to do comics, which I did. So I got Fabian and Louise, Fabian Siezler, Louise Simonson, Ron Lim, Jimmy Palmiotti, half a dozen other people. And of course, what we had also was Stan Lee, because at that point, somehow Stan was able to do side projects that they weren't considered directly competing with Marvel. So he had done these series of prose novels for Byron called Rift World. Sure. Novels are written by a guy named Bill McKay, but it was branded Stan Lee's Rift World. Stan was involved with developing and creating the characters and the scenarios for the novels. And then Byron wanted to do and did a comics adaptation that Stan scripted, and was involved with the plotting of also. So then I was Stan's editor on that, which, so that was part of my role there also as the liaison with Stan Lee on material he did, and I'd worked with Stan, even been his editor on a few projects over the years. So in some ways, it was like still being at Marvel because I was working with so many of the same people. But it was much different in that it was a much smaller company. You know, like I remember when in my first week there, I said to somebody, "Where's the mailroom?" And they pointed to the postage machine and said, "There's the mailroom."
Right.
So Danny, did you start as editor-in-chief, or was that something that developed as you were there?
At Marvel or at Byron Preiss?
No, at Virtual Comic and Byron Preiss.
Yeah, I started as editor-in-chief. I came, I was sort of part of, at Marvel there'd been a lot of title jockeying and title, they went from having one editor-in-chief to 5 editors-in-chief. So yeah, at Byron, that was a big thing. I believe I was vice president / editor-in-chief.
Yeah, that's what I saw, and I wondered, was it segmented between, because you guys were releasing them, obviously they were online, but they were also being distributed as print, is that right?
That was another kind of entity and enterprise that changed very quickly because I think Byron had been doing bits and pieces of experimenting with digital comics, and then he brought me in to run this line. So, yeah, we put them up. First, they were on, I think, the Virtual Comics website, but we also put them out on CD-ROM, and then we did print them. There was a big push. We took out a lot of ad space and had articles in the Buyer's Guide and in the Diamond catalog, and every once in a while at a convention I'll get somebody who will bring up those comics for me to sign. We also put them out as paperback editions, so we put them out in multiple iterations. I don't know if, obviously they never got the traction we were hoping they would. I mean, I think I look back on those, I think, they were very good imitation Marvel comics. I mean, we had very good Marvel creators. I was writing, I did one called The Skull with one L, so you could trademark it.
Oh, okay.
So it was me, Ron Lim, and Jimmy Palmiotti, and was it Greg Wozniak or Chris Wozniak? I always got those names mixed up. But one
That's
of them,
funny.
And they were, I thought they were very good comics. I kind of, basically me and Byron came up with the basic premises for the characters. It was a downtime in the market. In general, the characters did not have the name brand recognition of Spider-Man or Iron Man, although we did our best to imitate them,
And you did use the digital form to some degree, and y'all had like click and point discoveries on the panels and things like that?
Wow, you really, did you see that stuff online or on the CD-ROM?
There was a New York Times article in 1997, I think it was.
Holy cow.
about this stuff. And it was interesting because it introduced it talking about things like Shannon Wheeler and Desert Peach and that kind of online presence. And then it got to you and also Carl Pott doing VR1. And I was wondering about that. Were you guys both competing to get Marvel talent?
I don't know when you say competing to get Marvel talent, there was people we wanted, and if they weren't under exclusive contract, why not? There was a lot of ill will at that point. When that Marvolution, so-called, happened, a lot of people had their lives and their incomes severely disrupted. It's hard to explain if you haven't gone through it, but it wasn't just a matter of, we need to save money and we're going to, lay off X number of people. A lot of things shifted, a lot of promises that had been made or that had been kind of assumed to different people were broken, and there was just less work. You cancel a lot of books. There's just less work to go around. So were we competing? We just offered people, what we could offer them, and they either took it or not. And some people were eager to take it because either they felt badly treated by Marvel or they felt it was only a matter of time before they would be badly treated by Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea of Marvel or DC or any company as sort of having the freelancers' concerns as their first priority, that illusion was shattered, and people realized that there was every man for himself.
Mm-hmm.
You left there and went to work for a development visionary, was that because they were shutting down, or did you just make a lateral move?
Well, again, there was some overlap. Virtual Comics lasted just about 2 years, and then there was stuff going on at Virtual, which was part of Byron Preiss Multimedia, which was also a publicly held company. So there was stuff going on, and they shut down that department. I don't know, and to anybody who's ever worked in an internet startup, especially in that era, this will probably sound familiar, where someone will say to you, well, we can't afford to pay you anymore, but can you keep coming in so it looks like we're still in business? You can use our fax machines and our computers to send out resumes and make phone calls, but it would really help us if you could just... So that happened to me at a few different startups. So after Virtual, I was freelancing, some for DC and some for Eric Fine, and moved over to a company called, I forget the name, but Eric was editing at a kids' book company. I had probably one of my few jobs outside comics at another startup that was in the self-help area, where again, I brought in a lot of comics people to that. That was, again, a classic internet startup where they said, here, put together an editorial and writing department. So I had to hire like 20 or 30 people in like 2 weeks. That was an interesting thing to do. So while I was doing that, I was doing consulting for Visionary Media, which was founded by a guy named David Williams, who's actually now got a very interesting company with his brother called Pocket Watch. It's becoming a major player in the kids' entertainment online and non-online world. But David had started this Whirl Girl character, and he was kind of early into the digital entertainment world. And one of the people he had involved was a guy named Buzz Potamkin, who was a major player. He was the head of television at Hanna-Barbera. He was one of the people behind the I Want My MTV campaign and the Powerpuff Girls and the Berenstain Bears. Look at the name Buzz Potamkin. So he and a guy named Glenn Ginsberg were the people running this Visionary Media, and they had, a very simple, straightforward business model, which was we will put together various kinds of flash animated cartoons in various genres, and if somebody at a studio likes them, we'll make more, and we'll make a deal with them, and hopefully everybody will make money. There were some internet plays that were more complicated than that, or had more bells and whistles. This is really simple. Here's stuff. Do you like it? Okay, give us money, and we'll work with you on it. And that's where Whirl Girl came from. We had a half dozen other properties we were starting to work on, and that had been part of Showtime Online, just like actually Virtual Comics had been involved with the AOL Greenhouse for a while. There was a lot of shuffling of funding and corporate sponsorship in the Wild West era of the internet. So a similar thing happened. Virtual ran out of funding
and Whirl Girl actually was the first real example of media convergence, in that was playing online, but was also getting some television play, wasn't it?
I think he got a little bit of television play, because of the Showtime connection.
And Alex, that's interesting for you, because this was really an early example of motion comics, like the stuff that you play with. That's exactly what it was. I can't think of a much earlier example of it in that form.
Right. Although maybe that 60s Marvel those could be kind of seen as motion comics.
It is a prototype almost.
Prototype.
It's a little more motion than that. It was called Flash Animation. So it was pretty rudimentary. And before it had been that, I think when David first put it up, I think it was just still images with text. So
yeah.
As the bandwidth that more and more people had became higher and higher, you could do more with it. But I think doing full animation with it, there were a lot of companies doing various kinds of animation and some very interesting stuff. Again, there's one, Icebox. That was probably the most. Am I remembering that? I think Icebox was one of the better known ones. There were a lot of companies. There was some kind of cult popularity animated series, Hard Drinkin' Lincoln just comes to mind. There were Seth Feinberg, but he spelled it on his website ZETH. He did something called Bulbo, which was really hilarious. There were all these really interesting, bordering on brilliant webtoons that, of course, made no money.
Well, they didn't know how to make money, and the technology, the broadband wasn't quite there. It was ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
And then that led to one of my stranger gigs, if we're getting in the weeds of the oddball Danny Fingeroth gigs here. I ended up working on a Superman kind of choose-your-own-adventure CD-ROM at DC that I was on, and Louise was on, and a guy named Ryder Wyndham, a few other people. I mean, that was kind of a branching adventure.
When was that?
98, I think.
Oh, okay.
But it later on ended up on the Warner websites as a serialized adventure, and then I can tell you exactly when this next one is at Showtime. Oh, this is part of the J. Michael Straczynski Jeremiah show. Do you remember that show?
No.
Yeah, I do, actually. Yeah, and that one guy worked on it. He was Joe Kubert's friend from Eastern Europe. I forgot his name, but he had a graphic novel about Sarajevo and all that. Yeah, that was a Jeremiah show, right.
Oh, was it? Okay, yeah, I know. Not Irvin Rustmagic. No.
Yeah, him. Irvin Rustmagic was a producer of that show.
Maybe Rustmagic was involved with brokering the deal, because it was a French graphic novel by Herman Huppan.
Yeah.
I think
Oh, yeah.
But the show starred Luke Perry and Malcolm Jamal Warner.
Mm-hmm.
And the premise, it was a post-apocalyptic show, and I think everybody who'd hit puberty died. And this was 10 years later. So you had a lot of, 20-something people who looked good without clothes, because it was Showtime. It turned out to be a very good show, and very well written, especially the ones that Straczynski himself wrote. So what they wanted was this was around the time that AI had that website where, the Spielberg movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this website where if you wanted to participate, you gave them your phone number and they'd call you with all sorts of clues. There was some kind of contest or a scavenger hunt going on. So in that same light, what they wanted to do was they wanted to show what happened in those 10 years between whatever the apocalypse was and where the Jeremiah show kicked in. So it was basically, I think they're going to be done from the point of view of one or more of the scientists who unleashed whatever the horrible thing was that destroyed civilization. They would document how the world went to hell in a handbasket and how there were plagues and nuclear disasters and wars and terrorism. And I was doing it with a guy named Jim Proser, who's a novelist and whose father was like the manager of the Copacabana, but that's just a piece of showbiz trivia that. Anyway, so we're doing this thing, and then they needed it in a hurry, so they put me and him in a hotel room for like a week, and then 9/11 happened.
Right.
And suddenly, nobody wanted a website about plagues and terrorism and nuclear disasters and the end of the world going to hell in a handbasket.
Right, that's funny.
Yeah, I mean, it was grimly funny, but I mean, and to their credit, Showtime, paid us what they said they would and stuff. But that was something that could have been very big, but that real life took a hand in.
One question about your DC time there when you were because you didn't write a lot for DC, but you did do a Superman story, Too Close to Home, and I can't find it. Like, I don't have that issue, or if I do, it's somewhere.
It's an annual. It's in like one of their annual, the super specials.
Was that your only Superman comic?
No, I did another one. Actually, I got one that got reprinted numerous times. It was called Soul Survivor, or it was me, Randy Green, and I forget who inked it, but it appeared in I don't think it got printed in a Superman comic per se, but it's like in a DC super something, and then it was reprinted as part of a collection later on. It was a cool story. I doubt I'm the first person to come up with the premise, but the idea was a scientist on Earth who is convinced that the Earth is going to blow up and sends his son, or wants to send his son rocketing out into space, and so it was just a riff on the classic.
Oh yeah, that pops up every once in a while.
Yeah. So those were the two I did. I think all the work I did at DC, well, obviously that digital thing was for a different department, but I did 3 Superman stories for Joey Cavalieri. One of them never got printed, I think partly because he had given the art to a new guy who had a very kind of oddball style so maybe that was considered too oddball, but I don't even remember what the premise of that was, but it didn't get printed. And I was working for a while with Kevin Dooley on a miniseries, a spin-off from Chase. Was there a comic called Chase or a character called Chase?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was good. With the art was great on it.
Yeah, so I was pitching, I think, some kind of spin-off from that I think never happened, and then before anything got finalized, I think Kevin, for whatever reason, was no longer there. That was all the work I ended up doing. Oh, Well, I guess if you count, I think I did some Flintstones.
Oh, yeah?
Maybe. I think definitely a couple of Flintstone stories, maybe might have done one Jetson. But I mean, as far as the superheroes, that was all I did for DC.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. How did you get into working at TwoMorrows, and what did you start with?
TwoMorrows was a whole different kind of situation, because I was not working for them, I was working with them, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. In other words, Mike Manley was doing Draw Magazine, which is a wonderful magazine. If you haven't picked it up, I highly recommend it. Mm-hmm. And I basically looked at it and said to myself, wonder if they'd want to publish something that's about writing.
Right.
And I think I may have met John once or twice at the San Diego Con or something, so I basically either emailed him or called him. I think at the same time, I think he was thinking of a similar thing. I wonder if there'd be a market for a magazine about comics writing. So I happened to call him at the right time. It was a partnership. I wasn't ever working for John. It was more a matter of we were partners in this magazine.
Venture. And that's called WriteNow magazine, and it takes a reader...
It's called Danny Fingeroth WriteNow magazine.
Danny Fingeroth WriteNow magazine.
Yeah.
And WriteNow with a W. And it takes the reader behind the scenes of the comics industry, and it culminated into a best of compendium book. Tell us, how was it developing the format for WriteNow magazine, and how was it interviewing and talking to different people, and what was your mission statement with the magazine?
That's like 5 questions in one.
It is.
It ended up in the How to Create Comics from Script to Print book and the CD-ROM that Mike and I did. Perhaps the first ever trade magazine crossover in history. But I mean, that book, is still relevant. And it also ended up in the Stanley Universe book that I did with Tom.
Right.
That book sprang out of the 85th birthday issues that Roy did for Alter Ego and I did for WriteNow, and then I ended up going to Stan's archives and getting a lot of new material, never-before-seen stuff that made up the rest of the book. But it was very interesting for me. I'd done some editing of articles for some of the various Marvel magazines, the Xanadu Super Special, and, so I had some experience with editing and writing text like that, but I was certainly not a journalist by training or experience, So that led to some actual fortuitous accidents because I didn't know what you couldn't do. I mean, I'm very grateful on the first issue because I'm a writer and editor, and I lean so toward text that even though I had a lot of illustrations in the first issue, I didn't have nearly enough. And John, pointed that out to me. It was great doing those interviews. I'll tell you why in a second. But if you read by maybe the 5th issue, I'd gotten to sort of know what I was doing. But the first maybe 3, 4, 5 issues, there's a lot of interviews there that they go on quite a bit, and I think they're interesting, but in later issues, I probably would have trimmed them down some. So you're getting a lot more raw material in the first few issues. Here's the thing about writers and creative people in general, of course, and comics people in particular, is they spend, all day alone at their desk or their drawing board.
Right.
And I guess a lot of them, especially if you're inking or something that doesn't require a certain kind of concentration, you can be on the phone. But a lot of them are just focused on their work, and so when somebody asks them what they think or about their careers or about their theories on comics, they're more than happy to talk about it at length, so.
Could they live in their head most of the time?
Exactly. What I think I bring to a lot of things I do is this insider's point of view. So I'm asking them questions that a journalist or a historian or an academic might not think to ask. 2 things I found fascinating, among the things, I found very few people speaking complete sentences. Mm-hmm. Even people who seem like they're speaking complete sentences and who are very articulate and very intelligent speak in fragments and digressions. I think Jam DeMatteis is one of the few people who I ever interviewed who speaks incomplete sentences.
Interesting.
As if he was writing.
So transcripts get tricky that way.
Transcripts are tricky because you don't want to alter what someone says. You don't want to alter their meaning, but you need to also cut out the ums and the repetitions and the moments where they're kind of buying time while they're getting their thoughts together. So that's tricky. What I found fascinating was I had what was called nuts and bolts, that was literally I'd show scripts and plots and pencils and layouts and literally show how things were done. But for the interviews, you'd say to somebody something like, well, how did you break in, Mm-hmm. And they'd say, well, I was having lunch with John Byrne one day, and then he said, and I go, wait a minute, you're talking like everybody has lunch with John Byrne. How did you get to be someone who,
Right, go to the beginning.
And a lot of people would say things like that. They would leap ahead like 4 steps in their career. Like, somehow they would start the story when they were already, if not already a professional of some kind, then already had at least a foot in the door. And I found that interesting, that I often had to probably very annoyingly kind of try to backtrack. No, how did you get to that? How did you get to, the point was not to show, right? Obviously, no reader, you can't duplicate somebody's life, but I thought it was important to show that, well, look, you may not think you know anybody, but you probably know somebody who knows somebody, in some kind of position to at least get you in a door or get you a meeting or get your work in front. I mean, especially now in the age of the internet, that's even more true. But
right.
Back in the early 2000s, it was we had the internet, but it was, so I found that fascinating that so many people would skip ahead to like, so I'm talking to George Lucas. Like, how did you get to be in the room with George Lucas?
Right.
So.
Well, that's interesting. And so then that leads into, like you mentioned, the Stan Lee Universe 2011 book
right.
that you made with Roy Thomas. And it's full of interviews of people who were there during the 60s Marvel Renaissance and the creation of all those characters. How was it going through that? And did you learn things you didn't already know about that era?
All this history, like all history, right, has multiple layers to it. It was interesting. I know it's not like a great colorful word, but we did those interviews with people, and yeah, it was. I mean, I think especially say Al Jaffe, who I'd known. I got to know Al maybe a few years before that, and Al, who's 98 and still got all his marbles and, still doing the mad folding. But, so 10, 12, 14 years ago, it all ties in. It ties in with my books, too, because my starting to do conventions, because you get to meet these old-timers and you get to hear their stories, and you sort of hear where different people's stories contradict each other. And
right.
Everybody thinks of Al, of course, from Mad Magazine and the Mad Fold-In and the Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions. But Al worked for 10 years as a writer and editor and artist for Stan Lee.
Right. Right.
And the same with Jerry Robinson. And Stan and Will Eisner are two people that everybody worked for at some point for various reasons. People wanted to apprentice with Eisner because he was Eisner. People liked Stan as a person and as an editor, but he also had a high volume of work that he needed done. I think that was sort of one thing I realized, just how many people who you wouldn't think of as people who worked for and with Stan did that, and in what capacities. And also the idea of how Marvel grew and changed over the years, how big it had been in the 50s and then suddenly became small in 57 when they had one of the periodic implosions, and sort of how that gave birth to Marvel. I ended up going out to Stan's archives in Wyoming, which I recommend, and they're open to the public. You just have to get to Laramie, Wyoming. Stan's archives have a web finding page. Now, you can search out things, but the problem is that they are not always, because I think some of them were cataloged by people who don't know their comics history like you and I do, and who does? That's right. They don't know all the fine points. So some of it was ambiguously cataloged, and I tried to order some online, and I did. And what I got was technically what described, but it wasn't really what I was after. So I realized it would be good to take a trip out there. So we put that into the budget, and I went out there for a week. And I'd say the most fascinating stuff I found was a lot of radio shows Stan had been on in the 60s and 70s. And some of them were boilerplate, it's great, buy it kind of things. But some of them were very long-form, really fascinating interviews or debates or conversations. I'm thinking of one that Stan had with Hilda Mossey on the Barry Farber Show in 1968. Hilda Mossey was Frederick Wortham's partner in research and comics hating, And this was 10 years after, or more, close to 15 years after the Seduction of the Innocent, but it still was a very heated kind of discussion.
Right.
I found a recording of Stan and Jack in 1967 on a local New York station. So I had a lot of that stuff transcribed, and that's in the book, and so that was really the mind-blowing thing about going to that archive and just finding this stuff that had not been heard or seen in decades. And there's a lot of it. I think it would have been even more. At one point there was a fire at Marvel Productions, so Stan lost a lot of his stuff, but there was still a ton of material, and I had to go through it very quickly to try to determine what it was. But a very interesting thing about Stan was that for all his salesmanship and hucksterism and ballyhooing, if you listen close, he said a lot of stuff that was very frank and very honest, but he said it in the same tone that he would say that it's great, buy it, or I'm working on this, or I just had lunch with this big movie. You know, I mean, you really have to listen. But Stan always said stuff that was really remarkably frank for someone in the high-level position he was in, and including in these radio shows. So that, I think that, if anything, is one of the great selling points of the Stan Lee universe, and helped fuel a lot of my research and thinking about him for the biography, too.
Well, I see what you're saying, yeah. As far as Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, well, you and I spoke once in person about this, about there's a synergy and that the sum of the parts was greater than the individual parts.
Yeah.
Before Jim talks about Superman on the Couch with you, can you elaborate on that synergy that you feel occurred there?
I was a talking head last year in that series, that Robert Kirkman series on comics.
Yeah.
And I felt bad because there was, the interviewer was doing his job, right? His job was to get people to say controversial stuff. Even though I knew that it was going to be an interview like that, I kind of let myself get backed into a corner. So there's a clip of me going, "No Stan Lee, no Marvel Comics," as if I was negating Jack Kirby's or Steve Ditko's roles, Right. But I mean, sort of the full belief that I have is that without any of those, certainly without Stan, without Jack, without Steve, I mean, maybe you could say, since Steve, quote unquote, only did Spider-Man, their most popular character, and Doctor Strange, all three are irreplaceable, and in his way, Martin Goodman is irreplaceable. I mean, there's, he's sort of the power behind the curtain. I think all four. You look at the work they all did before and the work they all did after, and there's something magical. I don't think it's just that I was, 8 or 10 years old when that stuff came out. I mean, there's something magical about what they all did together that transcended, to me, what they'd done before or since. Everything then becomes a debate about credit and money, and those are not small topics. But I mean, as far as the magic on the page, and the sense of wonder that it engenders in a kid or an adult reader, I mean, I just think they all somehow, whether they loved or hated or got along with or didn't get along, whatever went on, what came out on the page was, I think, the best work of all their combined careers. Right.
Yeah, it's a special time.
Okay, let's move on to your books, because I want to have room for the three of them, and then we'll get to the new Stan Lee book. But I want to talk about Superman on the Couch. I want to talk about Disguised as Clark Kent, and I want to talk about The Rough Guide to Graphic Novels. So let's start with the first one, which would be Superman on the Couch. Now, was that your first straight up, I won't say textbook, but book that's not a comic book?
Pretty much. I had been writing some articles, for various online and print publications. And I've been doing a lot of writing, of course, for WriteNow. Not just the interviews, but there were articles and editorials. So I've been doing a lot of writing. And, of course, I've been writing my whole life. But, yeah, that was the first bookie book. I had my credit on some novels for Byron Preiss, but those, now it can be told, those 3 Spider-Man novels that were variously credited to me, Eric Fine and Pierce Askergren, they were plotted by me and Eric, and the actual novels were written by Pierce. But Byron didn't think, and probably correctly, that a novel should have more than 2 writers in the credits of any one novel. And I did some short stories. This was my first book of quote-unquote criticism or pop culture insight. And it came about a brilliant editor that I went to high school with, a guy named Van der Lamke. I ran into him at a high school reunion. And, we'd known each other somewhat over the years. But he said, do you have any ideas for books on comic books or superheroes? And I think I pitched him a half dozen ideas, and this was the one that he liked the most, and so I developed it from there.
Was this before Peter Coogan's book? And was he still working? He'd done his dissertation by now, I think.
Boy, I think it was before Coogan's book. Maybe it was being worked on simultaneously, but I think mine came out before Coogan.
Because you're both addressing what is a superhero in a lot of ways and asking a lot of interesting questions.
Although as opposed to Peter, I mean, Peter, sort of the point of his book is to say, here is a definition of superheroes.
Yes.
Mine was more of asking the questions and saying, it's a kind of very elastic kind of definition. So in that way, Peter and I took opposing point of views. But one thing that book did was it put me on the map with Peter and Randy Duncan and a lot of other comics academics. That sort of introduced me to this whole other world of people who are approaching comics in a much different way than I've ever been familiar with.
Which is cool that you can kind of cover it from both ends like that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also that I had... not that I'm the world's foremost authority in independent comics, but I'd always had an interest in underground comics and alternative comics. I realized they had a credibility. I think maybe back to my kind of fine arts film background, I realized there were a whole lot of ways to approach any medium.
Right.
So all this, I find it funny, and maybe I said this last time, but I still find it funny that people who know a lot about comics, including professionals in comics, when you mention the name Raina Telgemeier, they go, I never heard of that person. And you go, well, she's the highest selling graphic novels in the world, and then they'll go right back to saying, and comics are over, nobody's reading them. May I repeat, she sells 1 million of each graphic. So I think I was and am more interested and open to considering all sorts of comics, and I think that makes me a viable part. There's a whole world of comics academics, intellectuals that range all the way from people with PhDs and beyond to people like me who've been in the business, and people like Nikki Wheeler-Nicholson who, has a master's, although I think not in comics, but, she's somebody educated like that who also was the granddaughter of the founder of DC, and so there's a wide range of comics studies people and people writing and talking about comics. Anyway, to go back, so I know that's a much more complicated. What was your question about the book about Superman on the Couch?
Well,
isn't it also an exploration into like American identity and a deconstruction of the superhero genre? You really kind of dissect all this, don't you?
Yeah, well, I think what had happened is one of the reasons I even pitched the thing was it didn't seem to me that anybody since Wortham had written a book about superheroes and psychology, which seemed like a weird thing to me. That somehow that maybe Wortham made the topic so radioactive. So if you read Jerry Jones and the Jacobson Jones books about their history books, there's a lot of psychology in those. So I think there were different history books that maybe incorporated a lot of insights. I have to say mine. Ultimately, Superman on the Couch is probably more of a sociological than a psychological study, But I do try to deconstruct it and find the origins of it. A lot of it I look at now and I realize, boy, I really accepted a lot of the history as given at that time without question. There's a lot of kind of those creation myths of the heroes. Certainly nobody, as far as I could tell, had attempted that kind of approach since Wortham. And
it's a very funny book, though. I like a lot of you do things like calling the Justice League the Judgment League, because that was one of my favorite lines in the whole book. And you get into things like the Hulk, his anger versus Batman's anger. And I thought, talk about that for a minute, because I thought that was a brilliant section of the book.
It's so brilliant, I've forgotten it. You better remind me. What did I say?
So the Hulk anger is all out in it, like it's pure. It's a pure expression of anger with nothing else behind it. Whereas Batman, it's channeling it, and you basically go through and talk about how his anger creates everything that's about Batman, but it's a controlled anger.
I guess I did say that. What I remember, I don't know about discovering, but sort of what I found most fascinating was how so many of the superheroes are the product of a violent, sudden loss. A traumatic. To me, that was, not so much a surprise, but just how deeply it went. And I think I continue this in disguise as Clark Kent, and maybe put a finer focus of having a Jewish background on it. But that idea of everything you have could suddenly go away, and everything could be taken away, and everyone you love could disappear. And the fantasy, I guess, say with Batman and Robin Robin is a complicated character in general. That's no one since like the 50s has ever been able to really give a credible explanation of Robin. Right?
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't work today now, especially. It gets very, very tricky to do.
I mean, I have to say, I know it was controversial, but I really loved Frank Miller's take on it in All-Star Batman and Robin. Just, Batman is essentially abusing this kid, and his answer to any question is, I'm the goddamn Batman. Right?
Yeah, I like that too.
It sort of short circuits any, like, is it psychological or criminal abuse to bring a 12-year-old on your deadly I'm the goddamn Batman, shut up,
Yeah, right.
Having to eat rats was a bit too far for me, but...
Because at one point I considered, I remember having a long discussion with Denny O'Neil about how does he rationalize taking a 12-year-old and, really there's no really good answer, except it's comic books and it was the 1940s, who cared,
But Batman is a sadist, though. So for me, that Robin origin was consistent with just Batman being a sadist and Joker being a masochist and all that stuff.
But this whole thing about traumatic loss, I thought was very, gets to the heart of the characters and the heart of where they came from, which was the eve of World War II and the tail end. Of course, they didn't know it was the tail end of the Great Depression. And look at what's going on. Little Orphan Annie. There's so much in the dead end kid. There's so much in the culture about children or young adolescents tossed out on their own. I think it's so powerful, that whole metaphor. So the fantasy of I think one thing I do remember. I remember a lot of things, but one of the points I remember making was that whole fantasy of being an orphan. It's a nice vicarious fantasy if obviously if your parents actually do get killed in front of your eyes, not that would not be such a great thing psychologically or any other way. The fantasy of you and your pal Batman, fighting crime and dodging bullets, what a great fantasy.
Right, that's the fun part.
What I was trying to do with that book, although I was doing it for an academic publisher, and I'm hoping at some point in the next couple of years to do an updated version.
I was going to ask you about that.
That's next on my agenda. It just seems to me that with superheroes, even if the superhero, movie and TV genre fell off a cliff, then that would just be another chapter. Like, why did it fall off a cliff?
Well, you're writing this book and you're talking about why the audience is drawn to it in terms of film. And this is 4 years before Iron Man. You're drawing a lot of conclusions, but you'd have to want to rewrite some of that in light of what has happened,
I'd say Superman on the Couch was in print for like 14 years and went through like 4 or 5 printings. But at this point, the rights have reverted to that and to Disguise as Clark Kent. I have the rights to both those books back. Disguise as Clark Kent was unfortunate because it was the same editor, but shortly before that book came out, he parted ways with the company, so there was nobody. It was an orphan, so there was nobody whose, job depended on that book doing well, so it kind of got lost, although I personally think it's a much better written and researched book than Superman on the Couch.
And let's talk about that because we don't have all day.
Okay.
Let's talk about that one for a few minutes too, because that's an area that I think a lot of people like to argue about, get defensive about in relation to Shuster and Siegel and what Superman represents. And there's just so much of that topic of Jewishness in comics that I want to hear what you were aiming for.
Well, I mean, I given my background and my interests, I kind of knew that was there. And I have to say what sort of helped crystallize it was Ari Kaplan's series of articles in Reform Judaism magazine that later became his book, From Krakow to Krypton. At that point, I don't know if I'd met Ari yet, and I didn't know if he was that. Somehow it seemed, again, to talk with my editor, what would be a good follow-up Superman on the Couch, and this, it's a cliche that Jews like to buy books about Jews, but it's also true, so there's an audience for it, and I had a lot to say about it. I was hesitant. If you put in the term Jews and superheroes on Google, you will get as many hate sites as you do like Tribute or intellectual sites. I mean, it's a little scary. So I really thought, boy, am I just giving, whereas what I'm seeing as, yay us, we made these superheroes, somebody else who's inclined towards prejudice and anti-Semitism and nuttiness would have it's another Jewish conspiracy, So I really had to think a lot about that, and I think I addressed that in the book. And what I tried to not do is I clearly say, I'm seeing these Jewish metaphors and Jewish subtext, but clearly in 99% of the time, it's not with the the creators had in mind. What the creators had in mind was doing something that would have the widest possible appeal, but you can't separate them from their context. My favorite thing is Joe Simon, who was very nice, and anytime I met him was very complimentary and generous. He said there's no connection. He sent me an email saying there's no connection. We never were trying to do anything Jewish. It's a non-topic.
Right.
And I got permission from him to reprint that email. And then, I forget if this is in the book or not, they did that Captain America, the Death of Captain America story at Marvel, right around that time. And I'm listening to NPR one day, and Joe Simon is on, and the interviewer says, Mr. Simon, how do you feel about the fact that they've killed your character? And Joe says, I'm sitting Shiva for Captain America. And I'm thinking, well, that's pretty funny for a guy who sees no... I mean, it was a really funny thing to say and really appropriate. I thought, well, that's really, Joe's no idiot. He knew that would be like a great soundbite, but it's pretty funny for someone who said, "Oh, there's no Jewish connection at all."
Right.
For him to invoke that phrase, which is the name for the Jewish mourning custom is sitting in mourning for 7 days, Shiva meaning 7. And again, my favorite discovery was the Jewish subtext in the Thor, in the Norse god Thor, where he kept imploring Odin to let him marry the mortal Jane Foster, and Odin kept forbidding him to. It's Odin looking very biblical and rabbinical the way Kirby drew him with the beard, and finally Jane is willing to convert to become a god, and that becomes disastrous. I have no doubt that neither Stan nor Jack had any intention of that being the subtext of the story, but it's when you're sort of looking at it and when you're not looking for it, to me anyway, as a grown-up reading it, it just sort of popped out. And there's just a lot of interesting things in the history. So did Siegel and Schuster mean Superman to be a metaphor for Moses? I think it was there in their background. I think they had...
I don't think it matters whether it was intentional or subconscious. It seems like it's there.
I never, even people have tried to give a literal interpretation of the name Kal-El. To me, that was a little much. I think they didn't even give him that name till a while later. A lot of stuff that we think of the Superman mythology came later from different writers and different editors, and you can't not credit Mort Weisinger and Julie Schwartz with a lot of their contribution to the heroes. I sort of had fun with that book, but I think it's a serious topic as well. And I think I'd learn more about research and more about, if my books are about here's some research and here's what Danny thinks, I think I was more comfortable with both for Disguised as Clark Kent.
I just wanted to say, the whole time you're talking, I don't have that book. I have the others. So I'm walking around holding the Harvey P. Carr Yiddish book because
Yiddish guy, yeah.
Because you are in that one. So it was my way of connecting.
Well, it's pretty funny.
Yeah, I want to do the rough guide next because I think that's relatively important, and it's easy to brush off as just being part of a chain of books. But you've got a lot of really informative history in there, and it covers so many different topics and grounds. And a lot of this is not what one would expect from somebody who had worked at Marvel most of their career, in that you bring a great knowledge of what was happening in alternate comics and other things to it. So yeah, please talk about that.
That was fun. I get a call one day from the editor of that book, and he says, would you like to write the rough guide to graphic novels? And I said, sure. I said, but it is funny that you didn't call me when you did the rough guide to superheroes. I would have expected that, but sure. They offered me, it was a good financial deal, and I don't want to just brush it off by saying it was a work for hire, because, all the great comics we love are works for hire. I guess they asked me for a list. There were some things they wanted. It was done in a flurry. It was done very quickly. I tried to give a wide range of stuff. I thought it was funny that they said everything but superheroes, but they still put like a superhero scene on the cover.
Yeah.
Somebody at some point must have said, we'll sell more if we put a superhero battle on it. And I guess there must have been maybe Watchmen and some other stuff. Yeah, most of it was stuff I'd read for the purpose of the book.
Did you have help on it, or did you do it all the research yourself?
I think I did all the research myself. I think with the editor and maybe other people at Rough Guides, we probably decided on the list and what would be there. There were, again, this is so long since I've read that. Yeah, I'd say most of the stuff, I had an issue with a couple of things that they wanted, and I sort of insisted on putting in, inserting like certain editorial comments about them if I couldn't convince them not to have it in. But yeah, I think I recall a lot of just, whatever the parameters were, X number of main topics. I loved Harvey P. Carr and his work, and that actually led to my relationship with Harvey. I'd met Harvey once or twice at conventions. Hi, how you doing? But when I wrote so glowingly about him in the book, he called me, and that's how my relationship with Harvey really began.
Oh, that's great. That's really interesting.
Which led to, in 2009, which I can't believe is 10 years ago, but I did a series of 3 nights at the YIVO Institute, which is like a Jewish Yiddishist institution in New York. I did 3 nights in 2009 called Comics and the Jewish American Experience, that a guy who was running their cultural department then, Harold Steinblatt, saw my books on display in my local opticians. And he remembered that he knew me, and he contacted me. So suddenly I'm doing a night with Al Jaffe, a night with Harvey P. Carr, and a night with Jules Feiffer. Those are pretty amazing, Mm-hmm. And all these different things, I'm sure you know from your own careers, a thing you don't... I thought maybe having my book and I was friendly with my optician, so, he said, I like to put my clients, books or paintings on display. So I figured, well, maybe somebody will buy a copy of my book or something, having seen it. I didn't think it would lead to, somebody I knew from some other part of my life suddenly contacting me and me ending up being able to do these incredible nights with, that included the night where, that was just around, I knew Al a little, but in preparing for this evening, I got to know, we spent a lot of time together. He really wanted to do it right, and we spent a lot of time.
I want to ask you more about the nights, but let's go to Stan Lee first.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
And Alex?
So you did a lot of research for your upcoming book.
It's called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee.
It's basically his biography. Is that correct?
It is a biography.
Yes. And that's different from the Stan Lee Universe book, which focuses more on his Marvel creations. Did you interview his brother and other family members? How did you come about this?
I've been trying to get this off the ground for years because it's kind of a no-brainer. What would be the most likely book that people might be interested in who are not hardcore comics fan, but in the in the world outside that, a biography of Stan Lee. Well, it turns out I know Stan Lee. Right. So I tried. Dan and I talked about it at various points. I pitched the idea a couple of places, and I let it lay for a while. Then I pitched it, at an agent who pitched it. So it went through various phases. Was it going to be authorized? Turned out no, it's not. It's not authorized. But it's from an insider point of view. Yes, and so ultimately, when I told Stan I'd made the deal, he said, congratulations. I hope it sells well. He said, I'm not going to tell people talk to you or not talk to you. It's fully up to them. And at first he didn't want to do. He said I've done too many interviews, but then I would occasionally, in my subtle way, gently nag him about it. And I live in Washington Heights where he grew up, so I would occasionally send him photos of the George Washington Bridge at sunset, at George Washington at night. So I don't know if that touched some kind of sentimental chord, and for whatever reason, though, and I guess it was also during the period when I was his regular interviewer at the Wizard shows. Right. And I was traveling with Wizard for 4 years. So for whatever reason, he ultimately did decide that he would do an interview with me, and then he did a follow-up. So yeah, I have, and I asked him questions that, again, with guys like Stan and Will Eisner, who knows if you can ask him a question nobody's ever asked, but I think because I'd done my homework and because I knew him personally, I think I could ask him things and get answers that maybe he wouldn't have thought to give to somebody else. So and this is in the book, in the biography, there's a lot quote from my exclusive interviews with him, and I interviewed, with his brother Larry. That's the only family member I spoke to. Yeah, so Larry Lieber was obviously a source on this then. Right, and Neil Adams, and and I had a lot of those interviews left over, or not left over, but a lot of things I did for the Stan Lee Universe. So Jim Mooney, and I also spoke to Stan Goldberg's widow, and to Ken Ball, and to Ken Ball's daughter. God, a gazillion. Mark Evanier, Roy Thomas. I spoke to one of the people who invited Stan to his first speaking engagement at Bard in 1964. I just cold called her. Mm-hmm. She had a somewhat unusual name, so I was able to find her. Oh, and I figured she's either going to think I'm a nut and call the police or something, or she's going to be just talk on. And luckily it was the latter. She remembered it very well and talked. So I think I found a number of people who are not the usual suspects of being interviewed about Stan and about comics. I want to emphasize that it's not a history of Marvel Comics. It's a biography of Stan Lee.
Right.
So, I think Sean Howe did the comprehensive Marvel Comics history in many ways, but this is about Stan. So it's a lot with Jaffe, who I interviewed numerous times. Like, I have a list of 50 or 60.
Yeah, a lot of interviews
that I talked
But it
to.
sounds like you were as extensive as possible and interviewed everyone you could that was around in those times.
Yeah.
Do you go all the way to Final Days, or do you cut off at some point?
Well, I mean, yes, I go to Final Days, but, there's a lot of unfinished business regarding Stan's life. So, I mean, at a certain point, you just sort of have to say, as of press time, X, Y, and Z was happening. So it's not a book about Stan's final days, although obviously there's no way to not cover it.
And not have that part.
Because it was so wacky, every day a different story and every day a different party heard from about,
Yeah, that would seem like a tricky part to do from a legal standpoint.
Yeah.
You are correct. And yet you can't really ignore it, I guess you could just say I'm ending the biography at, 2015 or something, but that's really the 800-pound gorilla in the Stan Lee story, is those strange final days. And I think there is a book and maybe even a movie to be made about those, but I try to sort of put Stan in context of the comics business, of American history, of pop culture history, and I think a lot of it is about, again, how can you avoid it, his relationship with Kirby and Ditko, how can you not,
talk about them,
and try to sort of put it, in retrospect, I think oddly enough, what I bring is not just insider status and not just status as somebody who knew Stan, although I by no means claim to have been Stan's best friend. I knew him. He was a colleague. We were fond of each other, but I can't claim that I was his intimate, close buddy. But what I do bring is having been in a similar position to his as an editor and writer of comics. And I'm not claiming, obviously, that I was a groundbreaker or innovator in the same way he was, but that I can look at some of these controversies as someone on the inside, as a staff member at Marvel and in comics in general, and say, boy, this may look like one thing, but, there's another way to look at, whatever it is. So I think that I bring that in a way that someone who hasn't worked literally in the comic book business on staff, that, and those other people bring whatever they bring as journalists, as critics, as as full-time freelancers. But I do think I bring a certain insight that just comes with my own personal experience and career.
Right. A couple questions. So one, you come from a perspective of a writer in comic and a creator of characters and editor, much like Stan does. Do you feel like that gave you kind of a special insight? And then two, I think they say Jack Kirby had a very strong Jewish identity, and you've remarked on the Jewish identity. Did Stan Lee, did he express much to you as far as a Jewish identity? Did that come out of him?
I don't think he talked about it a lot. I mean, obviously I did an interview with him, back when I was doing Disguise as Clark Kent, and I quote from that. So I would say Stan did not emphasize his Jewish identity, but he wasn't, I don't think he was embarrassed or ashamed of it either. I mean, I did talk a lot about his childhood and his bar mitzvah and various other, I'd say there's insights into Stan's Jewish background in my book that you probably won't get anywhere else. So yeah, he always said that it wasn't, look, his Stanley Lieber,
right?
Maybe if it's an ambiguous name. It's not, if you put out a book with the name Stan Lieber, maybe some people would think it was a Jewish name, others would think it was a German name. It's certainly no more. I mean, Stan Lee is a name that only a 70-year-old kid would come up with. It's like, I'll break my name. Because I think a lot of people thought he was Asian just because, his name was Stan Lee, or
right.
If you were going to change your name. So I think he just did it because a lot of people in comics did it, whatever their nationality. And I think in those days, he didn't want to taint his chances of doing a great novel or becoming a journalist or whatever. So I think he didn't change his name because he didn't want people to know he was Jewish. I think he just wanted to simplify it and not have it be baggage when later on he would try to do whatever else.
Something else, yeah.
He didn't know that his fame and fortune would be connected to the name Stan Lee.
And another question before Jim talks about Will Eisner is the reinvention of Stan Lee, because him and Jack, they weren't exactly young chickens when they created the Marvel characters with Steve Ditko in the 60s. So like you were mentioning before, is that when you look at pictures of him from the 50s and the pictures from the 60s and after, the projection of his image with his hair, his sunglasses, that brand identity of Stan Lee, can you remark a bit on his reinvention of himself in the 60s and 70s?
That's an amazing thing. In any business, people get into a rut and they get into a habit, especially if they've been reasonably successful doing what they're doing. So I think that's what made Stan different. I think that's what made Will Eisner different. Kirby, I think, was just a dynamo of ideas. I mean, I don't think Kirby, I don't know if you could say Jack Kirby reinvented himself. Jack Kirby explored. I think Jack Kirby had an ongoing exploration of topics and themes that he'd always been interested in. Mm-hmm. I think that Stan somehow figured out, that he could and should rebrand himself and the company and make himself synonymous with the company. I think that's what makes him outstanding in that field. I mean, even, there were some people who had very long careers just because they were competent or even gifted artists or writers or editors, but I mean, you don't think of them in this decision to become somebody else. I think it was a combination of just Stan's natural inclination. I think it was also that his office was on Madison Avenue. Mm-hmm. I think when you're surrounded by Don Draper and other, by madmen types, and you sort of see, oh look, everything, look, you can rebrand toothpaste, you can rebrand breakfast, you can present and change how people and things are shown to the public and sold. I think being literally on Madison Avenue was an important part of that. And I think also when he started getting letters from people like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bales, he just sort of had a realization like, oh, there's this audience of college-educated adults, and while they won't ever, become our main audience, definitely somebody we can appeal to. And, look, whether did Joan ever really say to him, why don't you do comics the way you want to do it? Well, I'm guessing she said it to him like 1,000 times.
Mm-hmm. As an ongoing thing.
I'm guessing there was not one conversation, but I'm thinking it was just something, Marvel had almost disappeared just before that happened. Mm-hmm. And then you have, I think maybe the sudden death of Joe Maneely was a wake-up call to Stan, like, wow, We're not going to be here forever, Mm-hmm. I think a lot of different factors, and something about him, I mean, that's why he was Stan Lee, because he didn't retreat into a shell. I think Eisner had a similar but different realization, which we can talk about if you want. But Stan couldn't have done what he did without Kirby and without Ditko and without the other guy, but especially Kirby and Ditko. Mm-hmm. But I don't think Marvel would have existed without Stan either. I think, and without Martin Goodman willing to give thumbs up or thumbs down, or just to decide he was going to be hands off with Stan. I mean, that's part of what's in the book, how complicated that relationship was. I mean,
right.
Goodman didn't just happen to be Stan's relative. That was, a big part of why Marvel is Marvel, and the context. And Marvel also has the context of being part of Goodman's publishing empire, which was a strange and oddball array of magazines and books that Martin Goodman published, that Marvel was a part of, and yet with Stan it became much, its own thing.
Yeah. I have one Stan Lee related question, and then want to get to the other aspect of your career I'm interested in. In doing this book, have you gone back and read the other biographies that have come out in relatively recent years?
Well, there's the Bob Batchelor book, and there's the Raphael and Spurgeon book. What else?
And sort of Stan's own.
Right. they were very important books to read.
Is there repetition in terms of, do you go and look at the same archives and start from square one, or do you build upon the books that are previously done?
And do you feel like you've covered things that weren't in those books?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. It's funny because just the way I learned about kind of journalism in an oddball way from WriteNow, I learned about writing biography in an oddball way by writing this book, because suddenly I'm now going to biographers' events and meeting biographers and reading a lot of biographies and reading about biographies and what is, I mean, a classic one is I went to an event last year that was promoting a new 2-volume, I think, biography. Maybe, I forget if there's going to be a third or not, but at least it's a huge 2-volume biography of Sol Bellow, right? Well, it turns out that the reason this biography of Sol Bellow, this 2-volume biography exists, is because Sol Bellow's family didn't like the previous biography about Sol Bellow that somebody else wrote 10 years ago. So what I've discovered is that, right, let's say you go to a job interview and the guy says, tell me about your life. Or you're being interviewed on a podcast by somebody and they say, tell me about your career. Well, there's a million different ways to approach it.
Yes.
And you're really, in some ways, creating, even unintentionally, maybe even thinking you're telling, quote-unquote, the truth. There's a million ways to approach somebody's life. There's a million ways to approach and interpret the details of somebody's life. So have I discovered that Stan had a secret life as a spy and he was in disguise in Scandinavia for 10 years? No. I have not discovered that. But I think I have taken details of Stan's life, discovered new, interesting details, and put together a narrative that is still Stan Lee's life, but has a unique take on it. I think I have found details and people that other people have not covered, and given my insider point of view and whatever Danny Fingeroth intelligence or stupidity I bring to the table, I bring that. I think if I've done my job right, I will have pissed off both the unquestioning Stan Lee haters and the unquestioning Stan Lee lovers.
Oh, that's
almost
good.
Certainly.
So that's so yes, you can't. The basic building blocks of Stan's life, they're the basic building blocks of his life. But I think I've either discovered or intuited a lot of new things that other people haven't.
Right, that's great. We are excited to read it, and when can we expect it to come out? Is that set to be like November? Is that when?
It's set for October. I mean, I'm still hoping October, but somewhere in the fall. Somewhere. Well, with plenty of time to do your holiday shopping.
There you go. Pre-order now. All right.
All right. So let's talk about the few side things that you have done that are of great interest. One of them was, are you still the programming director for Wizard World? Or how long did that last?
That lasted 4 years. That lasted from 2013 to 2017. I was not the programming director. I was the director of the Danny Fingeroth panels. So
okay. Because you were emceeing a lot of panels at the time, right?
Yes. Well, I had done their show. They had a Wizard show in New York in 2013, and I had done a couple of panels there. And the guy who was running their programming, a guy named Chris Jansen, said, "Would you like to come on the road with us?" And so we and do a lot of panels. So we worked out a deal, and that's what I did. And I did, I would say, anywhere from 6 to 15 panels. At every show. I think Wizard wanted to up their game in panels, and Chris had worked at the San Diego Con in programming. So he was, then they hired him and he hired me to, as I did, became almost a marathon, I mean, obviously the 15 panels would be for some of their 4-day shows like Chicago or Philadelphia. But the idea was that because I knew the history and I knew the people, I could get people to their shows and to do panels who they might not ordinarily have done a Wizard show, or if they had done a Wizard show, they might not ordinarily have done a panel or done any show, So
what was the single greatest Wizard panel that you ever put together or did?
Wow. Well, look, one of the wackiest things. You know Ben Catcher's work?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, a lot of people don't. Ben is a genius. as you can tell, because I believe he got one of those MacArthur Genius Grants. Ben is best known for a strip he did in a New York paper, and probably for a bunch of independent papers, called Julius Knipple, Real Estate Photographer. But he's also done tons of other stuff, and he's got a very offbeat, idiosyncratic, hilarious point of view on the world. But he's not somebody you'd expect at a superhero convention. Wizard allowed me to invite him and bring him to the one of their New Orleans shows, and Ben was like, "Hey, a free trip to New Orleans." You know? So Ben Catcher came to the show, and he and Dean Haspiel did a panel where they read from their work as it was projected on screen. So that was pretty, for the 15 people in the audience, that was really great. I did a lot of history panels. There's a lot more interest in comics history than you'd think. I would do like a history, 1942 in comics or whatever, on a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and you think, well, nobody's coming to that, and suddenly there's 300 people showing up in the room, And what I would do is I'd get people, either other historians. Every city that's big enough to have a comic convention the size of a Wizard show is big enough to have a university. And every university of that size always has a couple of people who have tenure, who are teaching comics, so they can teach whatever the hell they want. And they're thrilled to come and, like the ass, to be on a panel, at a convention with comic artists and comic editors. And so I'm trying to, I'd say not a Wizard show. The wackiest panel I ever put together that I couldn't moderate a few years ago was I put together a panel that had Todd McFarlane and Raina Telgemeier on it, and then it was during my own kid's bar mitzvah, so
that's funny.
I couldn't go to it, but I was very proud of, like, holy cow, who else ever put Todd and Raina on a panel together?
That is such a weird combination.
But they both told me they loved it. Paul Levitt's moderated, so how big could it be? And I'm embarrassed, I'm not remembering exactly who else was on it, but I did a lot of how-to panels. I did panels with Barbara Slade and Tom DeFalco. What my strategy was, Wizards and whatever. I've done my famous Bob Dylan in comics. When Prince died, I did a Prince in comics with Dean Haspiel and Alex Lubet, who was a local Minneapolis music and comics and Judaic studies scholar. So Wizard, I have to say, it was very open to me. Of course, I'd have to do, and I was glad to. Here's Stan Lee, here's Rob Liefeld. Those were sort of no-brainers as far as comic conventions. But a Prince in comics, a Bob Dylan in comics, actually, one of my favorites was in Louisville. So whatever town Wizard was going to be in, I'd look at a map and I'd go, what comics professionals or academics or historians or whatever live within 50, 100, 150, 200 miles of this city? So Louisville, I'm going, Louisville. I went, let me look up the Louisville Sluggers, right? Louisville's a lot of different things and a lot of angles, but I thought, well, Louisville Sluggers has a museum, and the guy who curates the museum, based on my research, seems interested in comics. Cut to, here's my baseball and comics panel at the Wizard World Louisville show, with the curator of the Louisville Slugger Museum, who brought in all sorts of cool artifacts from like an animation show they were having, and to tie it into my other obsessions, brought in like some of their autographed bats, including a Louisville Slugger autographed by Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So that was maybe one of my favorites, was that baseball and comics panel.
So location really does matter, actually, on these things.
In certain things, if let's face it, because if somebody lives in that town, that means you don't have to pay for airfare and hotel for them, and they're there, and they have this expertise, and they're thrilled to do it, so why not?
That's cool.
So let's talk about the Night With ones that you did as well. You mentioned, I mainly want to hear about, for selfish reasons, I want to hear about Jules Feiffer. That was sort of my pathway into comics in a lot of ways.
Me too. Well, not really, not my pathway in, but my pathway into the history.
Yeah, exactly. I just relished that book when it came out. I was reading comics already, but that book made me aware of so much before Marvel.
Right. Yeah. Everybody. I think that was. That was an eye-opener for me. That was the holiday gift for that year, for 1965, was anybody who's interested in comics. That was the book you wanted.
Now, was Feiffer there? Was he on stage with you?
Yeah, yes.
Well, no, I went to a personal look at Feiffer, I think, in San Diego, and Paul Levitz was there by himself because Feiffer wasn't able to come at the time.
Well, it's funny, actually, I shouldn't have laughed because, just a couple of years ago, I did a thing with Feiffer, and it was via Skype, which was so I take back my derisive laughter, for that particular one. because he had moved out of Manhattan, but then he was still living in Manhattan. It's very funny because somehow, with all my contacts, nobody I knew how to get a hold of Feiffer. I mean, at least I couldn't find anybody. So I ended up, finally somebody said, well, he's got a website. Just send an email to his, I don't know why I didn't think of that, but I sent an email to his assistant, and his assistant said, at least at that point, I think Jules now does do email, but they said you have a better chance if you send him a fax. So I sent him a fax, and I dropped Will Eisner's name, and I said I did this interview with Eisner, it's been reprinted a lot, and 5 minutes later he called me, and it turned out he lived like 15 blocks from where I was living, but I just couldn't find the guy. My favorite Feiffer, I'll tell you about a different event, because this is, I think they're both funny stories, but a couple of years later I got to be, and I also interviewed, and the reason I was looking for Jules was interviewing for Disguise as Clark Kent. So
of course.
I became, somewhat friendly with him, and when I was early on in my relationship with the Will Eisner Foundation and studio, I was doing a night about Will Eisner at Columbia University, through Karen Green and her and also Jeremy Dauber, who was kind of the go-to comics people at Columbia. And so I think I'd sent Jules an email or a fax, but I hadn't heard back from him. Well, I'm in the cab on the way to the presentation, and Feiffer called me and says, I'm coming to your thing tonight, which I immediately got horribly nervous, and I was glad I didn't know before that, because I would have been horribly nervous for however long before I knew. So I'm there, and I'm doing my talk, and I know my Eisner pretty well, and I'm, blah, 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 here's my opinion, here's this fab, blah, blah, here's this, and I always do, one thing I do with most of my panels and presentations is elaborate PowerPoint slideshows. I found that's, especially for a visual medium like comics, it's good to do. So I'm going on about the classic spirit story, 10 minutes, what's 10 minutes in a man's life, and Feiffer raises his hand and says, I wrote that story when I was 17. I go, oh, okay. I hadn't known that. And then, of course, all the rest of the questions about that were directed to Jules. So I said, you know what? I'm going to sit down. And Jules, why don't you come up here and answer these questions? Because clearly they're not questions for me. They're for you. So that was, a very funny moment. I wrote that story when I was 17. The thing at the Yivo Institute, as part of that 3 nights, Comics and the Jewish American Dream, I knew him less well at that point. Again, I did my homework, and I was starting to ask him questions, and he says to me, if you're just going to read questions, what do I need you for? I could just read the question. I went, okay, and I literally threw the questions away, and we just kind of winged it from there, and it was great. It was, but that was up there with the moment with the Al Jaffe night when, again, I had, Al and I had met before. We talked about what we were going to discuss, but I asked some questions that as soon as it was out of my mouth, I knew it was a stupid question, and Al gave me some smart-ass response, which gave me the chance to say, ladies and gentlemen, I've just gotten a snappy answer to a stupid question. That was a great moment in that series. Well, I think I learned my lesson, luckily, through somebody else's. I was invited to be on a panel somewhere. I don't want to get too specific. The person was very nice, and they seemed reasonably passionate about comics, but it was me and Joe Kubert and 3 or 4 others. I mean, it was a hell of a panel, except for me, but it was really. And then the woman gets up, and her question basically was, so, graphic novels.
That was it.
That was pretty much it.
Open-ended.
Yeah, okay, and I'm I'm exaggerating a little, but it was not. So from that, I mean, it was fine because we were all, blabbermouths, and it turned out fine. But I never wanted to do that to anybody. If I ever did or ever do a panel, or I don't know the topic, I say that at the beginning. I just say, I don't, here's something that I don't know as much about as I wish I did, but I try to do. I mean, with the miracle of the internet, it's hard to have any excuse to come into a panel and not know anything about the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Feiffer was Jules was hilarious and funny, and and I've done a bunch of events with him, and really, I mean, if you've seen Feiffer, he doesn't need a moderator. I mean, it's nice that he agrees to have a moderator, but he's not exactly a guy who doesn't have a lot to say and is not a self-starter. It's just,
mm-hmm.
He's, got a lot of opinions, and he's very funny about expressing them. He's interesting. He's kind of like Stan in that way, in that his range of people that he's known and worked with is so vast and deep and goes into so many different corners of popular culture. That it's a remarkable to go from Will Eisner to Robert Altman to kids books to
everything. He just his political cartoons.
The 40 years at the Village Voice, right? I mean, that's what a career. Holy cow.
And now he's doing graphic novels, and they're fun. I mean, Kill My Mother and things like that. He just never stops. It's amazing.
And the last one, if you read the third part, it's a real, I don't want to give away too much, but it's very, all his work, obviously, he has, especially this, he talks about having Eisner on his shoulder, but especially the third part is very Eisner referential and deferential.
And Monroe, you could go on.
And he does, I think, once a month or every 2 weeks, something for a tablet magazine online. He does a bi-weekly or monthly strip. Tablet's
super active.
A Jewish-oriented website, and I would imagine that stuff will be collected at some point. Yeah, that's I think where he and Eisner and Stan and a couple other people keep reinventing themselves and keep trying to do new things. And that was a big thing with Stan, where once in a while he would do an old-timers panel, but he really resisted that. He much preferred to be on panels with young people talking about new stuff.
That's cool.
It's inevitable who he was, that somebody was going to ask him if he would talk about Marvel, but he really resisted being cataloged as an old-timer. And I think Eisner, Feiffer, they're just people who, Jaffe, no matter how old they get, they have more ideas. I ran into Al Jaffe on the street. I think I was going to see him, but he was, he was coming back from the hardware store because somebody had given him a piece of cork. And he said, I just bought some lumber because somebody gave me this cork, so I'm going to make a cork board out of it, which is like, Al, you could buy for $10, you could buy a cork board. But I had an amazing conversation with Al literally the other day. I went to visit him. I said, did you ever think of maybe, just coming up with ideas for fold-ins and letting other people execute them? You just supervise. And he said, well, no, because the fun for me is doing the execution. Having the idea is fun, but I love doing, it's wonderful that somebody, that old, that experience is like still thinking that way. And I know he's got notebooks full of ideas that if he lives to be 200, he'll never have time to execute.
Right, to do it all.
So there are some people like that are just, I don't know if it's genetic or what, but it's just amazing.
I'm going to close with Eisner, but I wanted to ask you about your experiences teaching comics as well, because you've done stuff at, both lecturing and speaking at things like Smithsonian and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but you've also taught things both online and at the New School and other places. Can you just talk about teaching comics?
Teaching comics is great fun. I'd say the most interesting thing about teaching comics, some of my students, I can't think of names, I'm not, offhand, have gone on to be professionals. Mostly I taught writing. Sometimes I teach history. It's a lot of fun. I would say that the most interesting change, I haven't taught for a few years just because I've been busy with other things, and also because it pays so badly, which I'll talk about in a minute. What's interesting is when I first started teaching, I was at New York University in their adult ed program. A wonderful writer named Michael Zamm hired me. He's written that Joan Crawford and Betty Davis show that was on and other TV shows. It was through the writing and TV department at NYU. When I first started teaching, it would be, maybe because people knew me mostly from Marvel, it would be like in a class of 16 students, there would be 15 guys and one woman. And as the years went on, I also did a lot of teaching, ran the education department and did a lot of work, including co-curating a couple of shows at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art. By the time I got near the end of my teaching years, which may happen again, I don't know, the classes were half to two-thirds women. So I thought that was a very interesting change. Maybe it was because of where it was. I don't know. And I did a lot of master classes that I ran at MoCA and did co-ventures with MoCA and NYU. So I had Howard Chaykin and J.M. DeMatteis and DeFalco and
cool.
Jamal Igle, Joe Quesada. I probably in the past 10, 15 years, I probably hosted or ran or whatever you want to call it, or moderated like 500 events. It's a little wacky. So teaching, I would just say it's criminal how badly teachers are paid, especially adjuncts. This is one of the great...
Yes, adjuncts especially. Do that a lot myself.
This is one of the great scandals in the educational system in this country that people, I enjoyed it and my students seemed to enjoy the classes, but the money was so, at least if I wasn't making money doing Right Now, at least I owned it, or co-owned it with TwoMorrows, and it had that pride of ownership, and that the magazine was a completely my vision. But to teach somewhere, if you're doing it right, you're putting in a lot of hours, not just the hours in class, but the hours of prep. And then if it's a script writing class where you're reading and critiquing the scripts, and man, I think it ends up for most adjuncts, well below minimum wage. So I mean, that's really one of the main reasons I stopped doing it. It was enjoyable, and it is a nice thing to have on my resume. And there are a number of Danny Fingeroth trained writers out there in the professional world, which I take pride in. But holy cow, the money was so bad. Whew.
So on that depressing note, let's move on to Eisner, specifically Eisner Weeks. If you could explain what that is and your role in that.
Will Eisner's legacy is controlled by his nephew, Carl Gropper, and Carl's wife, Nancy. They are the people who run the Eisner Foundation, the Eisner Studio. Pretty much any thing you see relating to Will Eisner has to be approved, and they came up with. So they, probably 10 or 12, maybe more years ago, I'm not sure exactly who came up with it. It was something called Will Eisner Week, which is the period, Will's birthday. Will was born on March 6th, 1917. We have this thing called Will Eisner Week that celebrates Will Eisner, his legacy, the spirit, the graphic novel in general, free speech as a concept and as an idea in practice. And so they brought me on, because I had done an event for them in New York, and I think I mentioned, I found Will's through a friend of mine who worked with him. My editor, actually, at Continuum, had also worked with a guy who just died within the past couple of months, who was Will's, literally his best friend in high school. And so I found him, and I got Chris Couch, who had been Eisner's editor at one point at Kitchen Sink, and I put together a couple other people, Denny O'Neill. I put together a panel in New York, and I met Carl and Nancy there, and they asked me to be the chair of Will Eisner Week. So basically it's what I do best, which is nag people. So what I do is I send out emails and letters and phone calls and say to people all over the country, here's Will Eisner Week. If you have any interest or regard for Will or the work he did or graphic novels in general, can you do an event, teach a class, do a radio show, do a podcast, hint, that you will brand as Will Eisner Week, and we will promote it. And the idea is to keep Will Eisner's legacy, both his, literal legacy of his graphic novels and his comics going, but also the, Will as an evangelist for and a lover of and a spreader of the word about comics, So that's what Will Eisner's Week, which it really, I think we peaked at Will's centennial year, which was in 2017, where we had close to 100 events worldwide in, live.
Wow.
And so I'll put out the word now. It's coming up. If anybody listening or if you guys want to do something relating to Will Eisner and Will Eisner Week in that period, I mean, we're happy to have people do stuff relating to Will anytime, but especially in that period, email me at danny@dannyfingeroth.com or go to the willeisner.com website. Would love to keep Will's work and his legacy in mind. So that's what Will Eisner Week is about.
Alex, let's bookmark that now and let's talk about it.
Absolutely.
That's exciting.
Danny, we wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for the time you put in for these interviews, because we really wanted to do here was, one, to show people what an interesting career and life that you're living, because you've done a lot and you've been part of a lot and you've met a lot of interesting people, and at the same time wanted to give people your insight into different things that happen in comic history, but also to learn more about the different books you've written. We're really thankful for the time that you put into this interview with us.
Well, I appreciate the interest. I just wanted to mention I will be at the San Diego Con, and I'll be, oddly enough, doing a number of panels there, so come check them out. Thank you, gentlemen, for all your time.
This has been a really fun episode of the Comic Book Historians Podcast. I'm Alex Grand with Jim Thompson, finishing up the interview of the life and times of Danny Fingeroth. Thank you for joining us today, Danny.
Thanks, Danny. The best is yet to come.